Welcome, weary traveller, to another journey through the mists of time. It's a pleasure to have you here, settling in for a bit of calm, immersive history to relax to. Before we begin our tale, I'm curious. Where in the world are you listening from at this very moment? What does the sky look like outside your window? Is it the dark of night, or perhaps a drowsy afternoon? Do share in the comments below, I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these quiet meanderings through yesteryear, designed to inform and soothe in equal measure, consider subscribing so you never miss an episode. There's something undeniably cozy about drifting off to the gentle cadence of history, and I'm honoured to be your guide. Tonight, we venture to a world both distant and strangely familiar, the harrowing existence of criminals in medieval times. An age of brutality and betrayal, yes, but also of daring exploits, wrenching remorse, and the enduring power of the human spirit against all odds. So make yourself comfortable, dear listener, and let us step back through the centuries to a time when survival was a daily battle, and the line between outlaw and hero was oft blurred indeed. Medieval Europe, that tumultuous period spanning roughly the 5th to the 15th centuries, was in many ways a world apart from our own. The rhythms of life were dictated by the turning of the seasons, the tolling of church bells, the iron grip of the feudal system. For the vast majority, it was an existence of unrelenting hardship, a constant struggle against famine, plague, and the whims of one's betters. In this unforgiving landscape, is it any wonder that some were driven to the fringes, forced to resort to thievery and violence to keep body and soul together? Highway robbers haunted the wooded roads, cut purses prowled the marketplaces, and bandits became folk heroes to the downtrodden peasantry. Yet the medieval world was one of stark contrasts. Against the grime and squalor stood the glittering majesty of the royal court, the sacred hush of the cathedral, the soaring battlements of the castle. And it was from these seats of power that a harsh, unyielding justice was meted out to any who dared transgress. Public spectacles of torture and execution were a common sight, serving as both entertainment and dire warning to the masses. The stocks and pillory, the branding iron and the gallows, these brutal instruments loomed large in the popular imagination, a reminder of the steep price to be paid for straying beyond the bounds of law and custom. But what of the individuals who found themselves on the wrong side of this pitiless system? What desperate circumstances drove them to risk life and limb? And what became of them in the end? These are the questions we'll be exploring in all their gritty, poignant detail. Through the mists of time, their stories call out to us. Tales of daring and defiance, of sin and redemption. The peasant highwayman, the charismatic bandit, the repentant killer. Each has much to teach us about the human condition and the thin line that separates any one of us from a life beyond the pale. So let us heed their whispers and walk a while in their footsteps, that we may better understand the cruel vicissitudes of fate that governed their world, and perhaps, in some small way, our own. But first, a word of caution. The journey we're about to embark upon is not for the faint of heart. The medieval underworld was a grim and unforgiving place, where life was often nasty, brutish, and short. But therein lies its morbid fascination, the knowledge that these were real people, driven to extremes by circumstances we can scarcely imagine. Through the alchemy of storytelling, we can resurrect them for a brief, haunting moment, not to glorify their deeds, but to bear witness to their humanity. So steel yourself, dear listener, for a harrowing descent into the dark heart of the Middle Ages. But take comfort too, in the knowledge that these long ago terrors can no longer touch us. We are safe in the present, wrapped in the hard-won security and civility of our modern age. And yet, as we drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps we'll spare a thought for those less fortunate souls, the ones who lived and died by the sword, the noose, and the iron fist of medieval justice. May their stories endure, a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we plunge headlong into the thick of it, let's take a moment to set the stage. Picture, if you will, the Europe of the 1200s. A patchwork of feudal kingdoms, each ruled by a monarch whose power was absolute in name, if not always in practice. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, serfs, and villeins who toiled in the fields and huddled in thatched hovels, life was a relentless cycle of back-breaking labour and grinding poverty. They were bound to the land, subject to the whims of their lords, and utterly at the mercy of the elements. In times of plenty, they might eke out a meagre existence, but all too often, their lives were upended by forces beyond their control. A failed harvest could mean starvation. A marauding army could reduce their village to ashes. And always, the spectre of disease loomed. The dreaded plague that struck without warning and decimated entire communities. Against this bleak backdrop, is it any wonder that crime flourished? For those on the margins of society, those with nothing left to lose, the lure of the open road and the glint of stolen gold could be impossible to resist. And so they took to the highways and byways, these desperate souls, the outlaws, the brigands, the highwaymen. Some were driven by pure survival instinct, resorting to petty thievery to keep hunger at bay. Others were motivated by a thirst for adventure or a desire to strike back at a system that had left them destitute and powerless. And a few, perhaps, were simply born bad, possessed of a wickedness that no circumstance could excuse. Whatever their reasons, these medieval malefactors would come to loom large in the popular imagination, their exploits celebrated in ballads and penny dreadfuls, their grisly fates held up as cautionary tales. And it is into their world that we now venture, dear listener, a world of danger and desperation, of high-stakes gambles and brutal reckonings. But fear not, for I shall be your trusty guide, illuminating the dark corners of history with the flickering light of scholarship. Together, we'll explore the social and economic forces that gave rise to medieval crime and the often horrific methods by which it was suppressed. We'll meet some of the era's most notorious outlaws, men like Jack Cornwall, the peasant farmer turned highway robber, and Eustace Foleville, the aristocratic gang leader with a Robin Hood complex. We'll follow them from their first tentative steps into a life of crime to their eventual downfall, whether at the end of a rope or in a moment of hard-won redemption. Along the way, we'll bear witness to the brutal realities of medieval justice, the grisly spectacles of public torture and execution that served as a warning to would-be wrongdoers. We'll explore the dank and dismal dungeons where the accused awaited their fate, and the ingenious instruments of pain that extracted confessions from the guilty and innocent alike. But we'll also pause to consider the human stories behind the headlines, the tales of love and loss, of hope and despair that animate even the most hardened criminal. For in the end, these were not monsters, but men and women pushed to the brink by a world that offered them precious little mercy. So settle in, dear listener, and let us journey back to a time when life was cheap and justice was swift and merciless. A time when the line between hero and villain was often blurred, and the price of survival could be one's very soul. It's a grim and haunting tale, to be sure, but one shot through with moments of courage, compassion, and even dark humour. For in the face of unimaginable adversity, the human spirit has a way of enduring, of finding light in the darkest of places and hope in the most hopeless of circumstances. And so, as we embark on this journey through the underworld of medieval Europe, let us do so with an open mind and a compassionate heart. Let us seek to understand, rather than judge, to find the humanity in even the most desperate and depraved of our forebears. For in doing so, we may just come to see our own world in a new light, to appreciate the progress we've made and the work that still remains to be done. And perhaps, just perhaps, we'll find a measure of empathy for those who came before us. The lost and the damned, the sinners and the saints, who lived and died in a time of unimaginable brutality. But enough of my philosophizing. The hour grows late, and the mists of time beckon. Let us step through the veil, you and I, into a world of cut purses and cudgels, of gallows and gibbets, a world where survival was a daily struggle, and mercy was in short supply. Welcome, dear listener, to the dark heart of the medieval underworld. May you find here not only morbid fascination, but also moments of unexpected poignancy, glimmers of light in the gathering gloom. And may you emerge from this journey with a renewed appreciation for the fragile blessings of peace, prosperity, and the rule of law. But I've tarried over long in setting the stage. The players await, the drama is about to unfold. So steel yourself, gentle listener, and let us descend together into the depths of the distant past. A past that is, in some ways, not so very distant at all. A past that echoes through the ages, whispering its secrets to those with ears to hear. Come then, let us heed its call and see what grim wonders await us in the annals of medieval crime and punishment. As we drift deeper into the sordid underworld of medieval crime, let us turn our gaze to one of the most infamous breeds of outlaw during this era, the charismatic bandit. While many highwaymen and robbers were driven to their illicit deeds by sheer desperation and poverty, a rare few seemed to revel in the thrill of the heist and the adoration of the common folk they claimed to champion. One such dashing rogue was Eustace Folville, a 14th century gentleman turned outlaw, who became a veritable folk hero in the English Midlands. Born into a respectable Leicestershire family, Folville seemed destined for a life of privilege and comfort. However, a fierce family feud and a taste for rebellion soon set him on a far different path. The tale goes that Folville took up arms against the crown after his cousin was unjustly imprisoned by the Sheriff of Nottingham. Vowing revenge, Eustace gathered a loyal gang of men and rode out to make the sheriff pay for his transgressions. In a daring raid, they ambushed and killed the sheriff and several of his men, then melted back into the dense Charnwood forest that became their refuge. But rather than flee as fugitives, Folville and his band embarked on an audacious new career as robbers. With a twist, they began targeting the most reviled figures of the common folk, the tax collectors. In an age of crushing inequality, ruthless collection of taxes and levies was deeply resented by the peasantry, who could barely afford to feed their families. By relieving these collectors of their ill-gotten lucre, and perhaps lightening their own purses in the process, Folville's gang soon won the adoration of the masses. The most legendary of these heists took place in 1326, during the reign of King Edward II. On a foggy morning, Eustace and his men ambushed an unsuspecting royal caravan transporting taxes collected by the tyrannical Duke of Exeter. The robbery was a smashing success, and while exact figures are uncertain, the haul was reportedly immense. But true to form, Folville made certain a generous cut of the spoils found its way into the hands of the impoverished locals, winning their eternal gratitude and loyalty in return. Of course, such audacious crimes against crown and state would not go unanswered forever. Royal writs were issued denouncing Folville as a notorious robber and offering a handsome bounty for his capture. The outlaw's family members were thrown in prison in hopes of drawing him out. Posses of sheriffs and soldiers scoured the countryside for Eustace and his men. Yet through a combination of local support, daring evasion, and perhaps just sheer boldness, Eustace and his Folville gang managed to elude capture for years. They became local legends. The gentleman thief and his merry men who robbed from the rich, gave to the poor and mocked the powers that be. Embellished tales of Eustace's exploits spread like wildfire through alehouses and marketplaces, growing in each retelling. Some stories claimed Eustace had a secret tunnel network beneath the forest to spirit away his loot. Others swore he could transform into a fox to evade pursuit by baying hound. Most famous of all was the tale of his archery contest with the devil himself, in which Folville wagered his soul in a test of skill, only to cheat the fiend with an impossible trick shot. As entertaining as such folk tales may be, the truth is, we may never know the full details behind the legend of Eustace Folville. What scraps of historical record remain suggest he did indeed lead a gang of highwaymen in Leicestershire for over a decade, robbing and killing at least a dozen men along the way. And in a strange twist of fate for an outlaw, Eustace was eventually pardoned by the very king who had long sought to hang him. In 1334, now middle-aged and weary of the fugitive life, Folville threw himself on the mercy of the young King Edward III, and much to everyone's shock, received it. Historians suspect Folville's pardon was granted in part because of shifting political winds at court that saw his enemies sidelined. Nevertheless, with his slayer slate wiped clean, Eustace Folville retired to his family estates, a free and wealthy man. He lived out his remaining years as a respected local figure, serving as bailiff and justice of the peace of all things. When he died around 1347, he was buried in the Folville family chapel, his gravestone bearing a jaunty effigy of a sword-bearing knight, the very picture of a medieval gentleman. So what are we to make of the swashbuckling saga of Eustace Folville? Was he truly a heroic rogue who stood up for the downtrodden against their oppressors, or just a self-serving thug with a knack for public relations? As is so often the case, the full truth likely lies somewhere in between. Like his spiritual successor, Robin Hood, a century later, Eustace was an outlaw who captured the public's imagination and cast himself as their champion, all while profiting handsomely off his crimes. Yet in an age of such brutal inequality and injustice, perhaps even a bandit who could tweak the nose of the powerful and give the masses a taste of ill-gotten wealth seemed a hero. Though Eustace Folville's swashbuckling days are long past, his legend endures as a reminder of how even in the medieval world's darkest corners, a spark of light could still capture hearts and minds. With a wink and a wandering hand, figures like Folville gave the desperate a dose of hope, mirth and mischief in lives so often starved for each. And while we may not endorse their methods from our cozy modern perch, we must concede these dashing outlaws injected a much-needed splash of colour into a very drab and dismal time. One can almost picture Eustace among his men in some musty tavern, regaling the eager crowd with his latest daring deeds as tankards clash and the minstrel plays. So, let us raise a glass to Eustace Folville, the gentleman thief, forest fox, and gallant rogue who tweaked the nose of tyrants and, for a brief, shining moment, brought a touch of justice to an unjust age. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and watch for wily foxes on the road. As the warm glow of Eustace's tale fades into the mists of history, we find ourselves drawn onward to explore yet another shadowy facet of medieval crime, one with a decidedly more sombre and complex character. For while roguish bandits like Folville may capture our imagination, the reality is that the vast majority of medieval lawbreakers were not so dashing, nor their ends so gentle. Next, we peer into the fraught and fearful world of crime and punishment for women in the Middle Ages. Beneath the grim, pious veneer of medieval society, dark currents of suspicion, superstition, and misogyny often flowed, sweeping untold numbers of women into the maw of justice. For a woman to be drawn into the criminal underworld of this era was a terrifying prospect indeed. The path to crime for medieval women was tragically often paved by simple desperation. With scant access to education, employment, or property rights, an unmarried or widowed woman faced daunting prospects for survival. Those who avoided abject poverty often found themselves trapped in the oldest profession. Others, perhaps separated from family or fleeing abuse, resorted to begging, vagrancy, and petty theft to survive. Yet these so-called crimes of poverty left countless women exposed to the harsh, unyielding brutality of medieval law. Whereas their male counterparts might face a lashing or short jail stint for such minor offences, female convicts routinely endured far worse. It was not uncommon for a woman to be subjected to savage floggings, public humiliation, or lengthy dungeon stays, often with little regard for the circumstances that led to their plight. Even more disturbing was the readiness with which medieval authorities could concoct charges of moral crimes against unruly or inconvenient women. The Inquisition was only too eager to extract confessions of witchcraft, heresy, and sexual impropriety from suspects via torture. Village gossip and jilted lovers could easily spark accusations that might see an innocent woman burned, drowned, or banished. The patriarchal paranoia of the time left women intensely vulnerable to such purges. Perhaps no female crime was regarded with more revulsion and fury in medieval times than that of infanticide. In an era of scant birth control and zero tolerance for unwed motherhood, untold numbers of desperate women resorted to the unthinkable. If discovered, the grisly act elicited no public sympathy, only swift and terrible retribution. Infanticidal mothers were routinely tortured, paraded in shame, and executed without mercy. One infamous case was that of Margaret Kitzsteiner, a 17-year-old German peasant who drowned her newborn in a well in 1580. Arrested and interrogated, Margaret confessed under torture to not only infanticide, but that she was a witch who copulated with the devil. Further denounced by vindictive neighbours, poor Margaret was publicly humiliated, savagely lashed, and finally beheaded before a jeering mob. Tragically, while Kitzsteiner's case is relatively well documented, the shocking scope of her cruel treatment was all too common for medieval women on the margins. Across Europe, unknown multitudes suffered similar fates for the crime of failing to uphold an unbending patriarchal order. Even as we recoil at their actions, we cannot help but shudder at the misogynistic machinery of torment and death that awaited so many women. And so we pause to consider, with mingled sorrow and anger, the legions of tragic Margarets, the desperate, discarded, and demonized who haunt the footnotes of medieval history. Theirs are the faces we cannot quite picture, the names left unrecorded, the injustices unredressed to the present day. We are left to wonder how many innocent lives were shattered under the pitiless hammer of a society that so feared the feminine. But let us draw some solace as we slip softly into slumber, that we inhabit a world grown, however haltingly, a bit more hospitable and humane for our sisters since those dark days. A world that strives, in fits and starts, to lift up the fallen and empower the powerless. And while medieval justice remains a nightmare to shudder us awake, with each generation we inch our way toward a brighter dawn. Rest well, weary traveller, and take heart, for you are not alone on this winding, hard-fought road. In the medieval world, the line between life and death was far more tenuous than it is today. With disease, famine, and violence ever-present threats, it's little wonder that some turned to crime out of sheer desperation. The brutal punishments awaiting those caught often proved an insufficient deterrent in the face of gnawing hunger or the lure of quick riches. Among the most notorious of these medieval malefactors was Jack Cornwall, a humble peasant farmer who turned to a life of highway robbery in 14th century England. Born into poverty and raised in a ramshackle hovel, Jack toiled in the fields from sunrise to sunset, breaking his back for the local lord in exchange for a few meagre scraps. As the years ground on, Jack watched his family slowly starve, his once ruddy-cheeked children reduced to little more than skin and bones. Finally, something within him snapped. He could no longer bear to watch his loved ones suffer while the wealthy grew fat off the fruits of his labor. And so, Jack hatched a plan as desperate as it was daring. Under cover of darkness, he began waylaying wealthy travelers on the lonely forest roads, first with little more than a stout club and a menacing scowl. But as his confidence grew, so too did his ambition. Jack soon graduated to a rusted sword pilfered from a dead soldier and a tattered black mask to conceal his identity. His modus operandi was simple but effective. Jack would lay in wait behind a blind curve, his lean frame concealed amid the dense underbrush. When a likely mark approached, he would leap out with a fearsome bellow, brandishing his blade and demanding their purse. Most were so startled, they readily complied. In this fashion, Jack Cornwall managed to eke out a living on the margins of society, his ill-gotten gains providing a much-needed supplement to his family's paltry income. For a time, it seemed as though he might actually get away with it, until a chance encounter with a wealthy merchant would seal his fate. The portly trader was not so easily cowed as Jack's usual targets. When the highwayman demanded his gold, the merchant drew a dagger from his cloak and lunged at Jack with a speed belying his bulk. Caught off guard, Jack fell backwards, cracking his head on a stone. The last thing he saw as his vision went black was the merchant's face leering over him in triumph. Jack awoke to find himself shackled in a dank, foul-smelling cell, his head throbbing and his mouth cottony with thirst. He languished there for days, the seconds seeming to ooze by in the chilling damp and pestilential rot of his dungeon confines. The rare shafts of light that penetrated his cell came tinged with an ominous reddish hue, as if the very sun had been stained by the blood of centuries' worth of unfortunate occupants. When the day of his trial finally arrived, Jack was dragged before a court of landed nobles and self-satisfied clerics, their bejeweled fingers and sumptuous robes, a sharp contrast to his own filthy rags and gaunt, unshaven features. He knew at once that he could expect no mercy from such an audience. The proceedings were little more than a farce, a foregone conclusion. The sneering merchant recounted Jack's attack in exaggerated detail, painting himself as the heroic victor over a deranged, bloodthirsty villain. No one asked Jack for his version of events. No one cared that his crimes had been driven by deprivation and despair, rather than greed or malice. In the end, the sentence was as swift as it was cruel. Death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn the following day. A hush fell over the courtroom, broken only by a strangled sob from Jack's wife, who had come to bear witness to her husband's fate. Babe in arms. That night in his cell, Jack stared at the stone walls, the guttering torchlight tracing capering demon shadows across their clammy expanse. He thought of his family, of the empty belly and broken heart his death would leave behind. Mostly, though, he thought of the bitter unfairness of it all, of the yawning chasm between the haves and have-nots that had swallowed him whole. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the bars of his cell window, he almost welcomed the oblivion to come. They came for him at first light, a trio of burly guards who hauled him up from the filthy straw and dragged him stumbling out into the morning chill. A small crowd had gathered to witness his end, their faces a mix of pity, contempt, and morbid anticipation. In their midst, he glimpsed his wife, tears streaking her pale cheeks as she clutched their wailing infant son. Jack barely felt the rough hemp of the noose as it settled around his neck. So consumed was he by the anguish in his love's eyes. The hooded executioner muttered a half-hearted prayer, more for the benefit of the spectators than the condemned. And then, with a sudden jerk and a sickening crack, Jack Cornwall, peasant farmer turned highwayman, was no more, just one more wretched soul ground beneath the wheels of a merciless world. His body was left to twist in the wind as a grim reminder to any who might follow in his footsteps, a forlorn human scarecrow unheeded by the circling carrion birds. Passers-by would later report that his lifeless face seemed etched with a profound sadness beyond mere death, an unending lament for the injustice that had defined his life, and so many others like it. In time, Jack's story would fade from memory, lost amid the numberless ranks of the downtrodden and desperate. But for a fleeting moment, his name had stood as a symbol of defiance against a world stacked hopelessly against the lowly likes of him. A small, flickering light of resistance in an age of darkness. Such public spectacles of harsh justice were all too common in medieval Europe. In an era without a formal police force or systematic means of law enforcement, grisly punishments were seen as a necessary deterrent to keep the discontented rabble in line. The logic was brutally simple. Make an example horrific enough, and others would think twice before straying into crime. And so, miscreants might find themselves subjected to a litany of stomach-churning tortures. Flogging was a popular choice, the lash biting deep into quivering flesh until the victim's back was reduced to a raw, oozing checkerboard of welts and gashes. The stocks and pillory were also much in vogue, leaving the guilty party vulnerable to whatever humiliations or abuse a vengeful public might rain down upon them. Other punishments were more psychologically cruel than physically agonizing. Branding, for instance, ensured that a criminal would be forever marked as an outcast, shunned by respectable society, no matter how sincerely they might repent. Likewise, mutilations, the severing of a hand or splitting of the nose, left the offender permanently disfigured, an embodied cautionary tale against the wages of sin. Perhaps most feared of all was the spectre of gibbeting, having one's corpse tarred and encased in a wrought iron cage, left to sway in the breeze at a crossroads or other public place. To decompose in full view of the world, carrion birds pecking at your rotting features as your empty eye sockets stared in mute accusation at passers-by. It was a fate too chilling to contemplate. But such was the way of justice in an age of cruelty and caprice. When life was so often nasty, brutish and short, what were a few more horrors heaped upon the heads of the damned? The medieval mind saw in such punishments not just retribution, but a macabre form of theatre, a morality play written in blood and agony to keep a seething underclass in check. Of course, not all who ran afoul of the law faced such a grim and ignoble end. Those with wealth or status could often negotiate for lighter sentences or wriggle out of consequences altogether. The poor, however, people like Jack Cornwall, enjoyed no such privilege. For them, even a minor infraction could spell disaster, a one-way ticket to the noose or the torturer's rack. And so, they crowded into dank, miserable dungeons, the forsaken and forlorn byproducts of a society built on ruthless hierarchy. There, in the shadow-haunted bowels of medieval castles, a special hell awaited those unfortunate enough to find themselves at the mercy of the law. It is difficult for us now to conceive of the abject horror of those cramped stone oubliettes, where prisoners huddled together in the dark, forgotten by the world above. The lucky ones might have a tiny barred window high up the wall, admitting a single anemic shaft of light. The unlucky made do with guttering torches or tallow candles, their fitful illumination scarcely piercing the gloom. The stench in those underground warrens was unimaginable, a noxious melange of unwashed bodies, overflowing chamber pots, and mouldering food scraps. Vermin scurried underfoot, grown fat and bold on the prisoner's leavings. The damp chill seeped into the marrow of one's bones, inescapable and soul-wearying. But worse than the physical privations were the muffled echoes of despair that reverberated through those clammy corridors. At all hours, the faint sounds of sobbing, raving, and piteous pleading wafted from behind the iron-banded doors. The cries of men and women pushed beyond the limits of sanity and endurance, their minds shattered by unrelenting misery. Many left their mark on those walls in desperate scratchings. A name, a plea, or a crude etching of a lost loved one's face. Poignant reminders that real human beings had suffered and languished in those hellish confines. Some of those graffitied messages still survive today, faded and worn, but still legible. Ghostly whisperings from a distant age of sorrow. Few prisoners emerged from such nightmarish captivity unscathed. Even those who managed to avoid the worst tortures were often broken in body and spirit, aged beyond their years by the unremitting trauma of their confinement. Some simply wasted away, succumbing to disease or starvation, unmourned and forgotten in the dark. Others took their own lives, unable to bear another day in such purgatory. They hanged themselves with knotted bedsheets or dashed their heads against the unyielding stone until blessed oblivion claimed them. Such was the ferocious tenacity of the human will to suffer that these acts of self-annihilation were often the only form of agency left to the damned. But amidst all this anguish and abasement, there were also fleeting moments of grim solidarity. Prisoners would sometimes band together, sharing what meagre scraps of food or comfort they could muster. They would tell each other stories or sing bawdy songs to keep despair at bay, their defiant laughter ringing out in the fetid darkness like a herald of unbroken spirit. In the dungeons, the usual barriers of class and status melted away. A common wretchedness bound the inmates together, from lowly pickpocket to disgraced nobleman. All were equals in the eyes of the dank stone walls and scurrying rats. And in that shared degradation, they found a strange sort of kinship, a reminder that even in the depths of misery, humanity endures. For most, of course, it was but a temporary reprieve. The grim fates that awaited them beyond the dungeon walls loomed ever present, an inescapable doom. But for a few precious moments, in that camaraderie of the damned, they could forget the horror of their lot and feel a little less alone in the uncaring void of a brutal world. Such was the lot of the medieval prisoner, a descent into a lightless underworld of suffering and despair, where the only escape was often death itself. And yet, even in that abyss of torment, the indomitable human spirit flickered on, an ember of defiance amidst the all-consuming dark. But not all those who ran afoul of the law were doomed to such a bleak and anonymous end. Some, through a combination of wit, daring, and sheer brazenness, managed to carve out a strange sort of celebrity for themselves, becoming the stuff of tavern songs and whispered legend. Such was the case with Eustace Folville, a dashing 14th century outlaw who charmed and bedeviled the English Midlands in equal measure. Born to a once proud family fallen on hard times, young Eustace seemed destined for a life of genteel poverty and obscurity, but a seething resentment burned in his breast, a sense that the world owed him more than the meagre lot he'd been handed. And so, like many a desperate man before him, Eustace turned to a life of crime. But where others resorted to brute force and crude banditry, Folville employed a rakish charm and keen wit that soon made him the talk of the Shire. With a band of loyal followers at his back, he set about relieving wealthy travellers of their gold with a smile and a courtly bow. But Eustace Folville was no common thief. He saw himself as a sort of Robin Hood figure, a dashing rogue who robbed from the rich to give to the poor, though in truth, he kept a healthy portion for himself. He cultivated an air of gentility, donning fine clothes and presenting himself as a wronged nobleman, forced into outlawry by cruel circumstance. This carefully crafted persona served him well. Tales of his exploits spread far and wide, often growing in the telling. Peasants whispered admiringly of the gallant highwayman who had beaten the wealthy at their own game, while ladies swooned at the thought of a dangerous but alluring rogue. Even some of his victims couldn't help but be charmed by his silver tongue and dashing demeanour. But Folville's specialty was harassing the tax collectors and agents of the crown, a risky business that nonetheless earned him folk hero status among the overtaxed populace. He and his men would lay in wait along forest roads, springing out to ambush the unsuspecting officials and relieve them of their heavy chests of coin. These daring raids became the stuff of legend. Eustace's merry band always seeming to melt back into the greenwood before the sheriff's men could catch their scent. The people revelled in these stories of the wily outlaws putting one over on the grasping royal authorities. In Eustace Folville, they found a vicarious champion against the crushing weight of the feudal system. Of course, the powers that be were less than amused by Folville's antics. They pursued him doggedly, eager to make an example of this brazen upstart who dared to flout their authority. But Eustace always seemed to stay one step ahead, foiling their traps with cunning ruses and harrowing narrow escapes. Once, it's said, he allowed himself to be captured, only to slip his bonds at the last minute and lead his flustered pursuers on a merry chase through a nearby village, vaulting fences and shimmying up drainpipes as they blundered along behind. By the time they thought to corral him, he had vanished into the ether, his mocking laughter echoing behind him. Another time, cornered in a disreputable tavern, Eustace allegedly donned a habit and blacked out his teeth with soot, posing as an addled old monk. When the sheriff's men came calling, he confounded them with crazed gibberish and lurching capering until they left in consternation, never realizing how close they'd come to their quarry. Such bold escapades only burnished Folville's aura of rakish invincibility. In the popular imagination, he took on the dimensions of a figure of myth and romance, a gallant laughing cavalier who played the mighty for fools and always got the better of his bumbling pursuers. No degenerate cutthroat he, but a proper gentleman of the road. But of course, the reality was likely a good deal less rosy. For all his flair and panache, Eustace was still a hunted man, forced to live on the margins and in the margins, and constant fear of capture. And while he played at being a friend to the downtrodden, his depredations often left honest travellers and merchants impoverished and reeling. Yet even this could not completely dim his lustre in the eyes of a people desperate for any glimmer of hope or defiance in a bleak and oppressive world. In Eustace Folville, they found a dashing avatar onto whom they could project their own fantasies of resistance and wish fulfillment. His legend grew to overshadow the squalid realities of his trade. And in this, perhaps, there is a lesson about the human capacity for myth-making, the eternal yearning for romance and heroes, even in the midst of misery. Faced with the grinding brutalities of a world arrayed against them, the common folk sought solace in tall tales and the comforting lie of the noble outlaw. For Eustace Folville, charming predator, gallant rogue, enigma wrapped in homespun legend, may have been in large part a creation of desperate imagination. But in giving life to his fanciful exploits, his admirers also nurtured the embers of their. As we've seen, the life of a medieval criminal was often nasty, brutish and short. But amid all the cruelty and squalor, there were glimmers of humanity, even among the most notorious outlaws. Take the story of Robert of Alton, a disgraced knight who terrorized 13th century England. Born to a noble family, Robert seemed destined for a life of chivalry and honor. But war had other plans. While fighting in France, he committed unspeakable atrocities against civilians, burning villages, slaughtering women and children. The carnage fractured his mind. Robert returned home a changed man, his soul shattered and conscience unbound. Turning to a life of crime, Robert embarked on a one-man reign of terror across the English countryside. No traveller was safe from his ambushes. He killed indiscriminately, driven by some inner torment. The crown put a handsome bounty on the mad knight's head, but Robert's cunning and brutality kept him one step ahead of the law. Until one cold autumn evening, when his luck finally ran out. Villagers he had been terrorizing lay in wait and captured Robert in a dramatic showdown. In chains, he was hauled before the magistrate to face a long list of heinous charges. The kingdom clamored for Robert's head. A public execution was hastily arranged. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. to serve as a warning to other would-be bandits. The Mad Knight's fate was sealed. But a strange thing happened in Robert's dank dungeon cell as he awaited his grisly end. The killer began to repent. According to legend, Robert furiously wrote his life story on mouldy parchment by the light of a single candle. In shaky prose, he confessed his sins and begged for God's mercy. Robert's 11th hour conversion became the talk of the town. Could such an evil man truly be saved? The debate raged as the execution loomed. Chroniclers say a priest snuck into the dungeon and heard the knight's last confession, administering final rites. Grim crowds gathered for Robert's hanging at dawn, eager to see the notorious killer receive justice. But the broken man who stood before them was not the same defiant outlaw. Head bowed, Robert publicly recanted his crimes and begged the victims' families for forgiveness. As he stepped up to the gallows, Robert extended his bound wrist to the executioner and gazed to the heavens. "Lord," he cried out, "thy will be done." The noose snapped tight, and the knight went limp, his body left to twist in the wind as a macabre reminder. Robert's story was a medieval sensation. The murderer who found God in his darkest hour. His crude autobiography was copied and passed around, becoming an early true crime bestseller. Some believed Robert's conversion was genuine, while others dismissed it as a desperate attempt to avoid damnation. But in a world with so little mercy, even a glimmer of redemption captured the public's imagination. Robert's grisly end became a popular subject for gory medieval morality plays, where his final penitence always earned an angel's pardon. In the end, Robert of Alton's story endures not because of his crimes, but because of his remorse. His is a very human tale of sin, punishment, and the hope of forgiveness. For even in the face of certain death, it is never too late to repent. While Robert's violent exploits may have been extreme, his yearning for salvation was not unique. Across the Middle Ages, many criminals sought to make peace with God before facing the executioner. The church held powerful sway, and the promise of divine mercy was often a condemned man's last comfort. Medieval execution rituals were designed as much for spiritual redemption as physical punishment. Proceedings often began with an elaborate public mass where the condemned would receive last rites. A priest would then escort the criminal to the scaffold, urging repentance and leading prayers. Even the execution itself took on a perverse religious ceremony at times. According to some accounts, crucifix-shaped gallows were used so that felons could die in the same manner as Christ. The spilling of their blood was symbolically linked to holy sacrifice. After the grim deed was done, a final indignity awaited most executed criminals: dissection. Since they often died in a state of sin, their corpses were considered property of the state to dispose of as it saw fit. Many were handed over to the medical schools for crude anatomy lessons. Others were gibbeted, left to rot in iron cages as a warning. But not all criminals were resigned to a grisly public death or anonymous dissection. Right up until the end, some violently resisted their fate, making desperate bids for escape or rescue. Others faced the noose stoically, stubbornly refusing to repent or beg for mercy. A few even used their execution as a final act of defiance against authority. The execution scaffold could become an early speaker's corner. Condemned outlaws might denounce the corrupt system that had doomed them, or passionately plead their case to the gathered crowds. In 1305, Scottish rebel William Wallace famously used his last breath to cry out for freedom before being hanged, drawn, and quartered. His final shout of "Mercy!" was not a plea for himself, but for the common people suffering under English tyranny. As word of such dramatic executions spread, a few doomed criminals seized their chance at immortality, determined to be remembered as martyrs and folk heroes. For men and women with little power in life, Choosing how they faced death was their last chance to shape their own legacy. So while the violent lives of medieval criminals often ended at the scaffold, their stories lived on, whispered around campfires, scribbled in chronicles, and enacted on festival stages. In a largely illiterate society, tales of daring outlaws, jailhouse repenters, and defiant martyrs became a form of medieval pop culture. For peasants ground down by poverty and powerlessness, these criminal legends were a source of grim fascination and vicarious thrills. They offered a glimpse of adventure beyond the drudgery of feudal life. And in some cases, they provided a subtle outlet for social criticism, a commoner's eye view of injustice. Of course, we must be wary of romanticizing the criminals of the Middle Ages, or reading too much into their enduring tales. Most were desperate outcasts, not dashing rogues, and their victims' suffering was all too real. But in a world with so little empathy for the poor and powerless, even their grisly stories found an eager audience. So what are we to make of the brutal lives of medieval criminals in the end? On one level, they simply reflect the harshness of their era, a world of rampant inequality, cruelty, and superstition. Theirs was not a romantic age, but a pitiless one that drove many to unspeakable deeds. But if we listen closely to whispers of humanity amid the horror, a more nuanced picture emerges. Behind every medieval outlaw tale is a real person pushed to the brink by hardship, broken by trauma, or twisted by unchecked power. Their crimes may repel us, but their all too human flaws and yearnings still resonate across the centuries. We see in them echoes of our own potential for both cruelty and redemption. How many of us, ground down by poverty and pain, might be capable of terrible things? In the end, perhaps the true value of pondering these long-ago criminal lives is the empathy it stirs in us, a recognition of our common frailties and hopes. For all our modern sophistication, are we really so different from our medieval forebears, stumbling through a world that is often brutish and unfair? As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those distant days of chainmail and dungeons, plagues and putrid streets. Imagine yourself in the place of some scrawny medieval peasant, gazing up at the severed heads above the town gates. What flickers of life, however unfortunate, once animated those vacant eyes? Hold that thought as you slip into dreams, your warm bed a world away from a cold stone cell. Breathe in gratitude for our relatively gentle modern age. The monstrous criminals of the Middle Ages have long since mouldered to dust, but their very human stories linger, inviting us to ponder the crooked timber of our species. And so, our grim historical tour draws to a close. The next time you find yourself grumbling about some petty modern inconvenience, cast your mind back to the short, ungentle lives of medieval criminals. Suddenly, that long line at the DMV might not seem so dire. Progress may be imperfect, but it's a hard-won gift. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of kinder centuries. Let the muffled sounds of the modern world, the hum of late-night traffic, the muted barks of neighborhood dogs, soothe you into slumber. How lucky are we to drift off without fear of barbarians at the gates or brigands in the shadows. Our world is still far from perfect, of course, but it's a far cry from the desperate, disease-ridden societies that drove so many medieval men and women to unspeakable deeds. We may yet build a civilization where fewer fall through the cracks into brutality. The arc of history is long, but perhaps it bends toward mercy in the end. So rest now and savor these last drowsy moments of wakefulness, poised between the dark dreams of history and the gradual dawn of a better world. Let the hard-learned lessons of the past whisper into your waiting ears, and may your sleep be sweet, and your tomorrows ever more gentle. As we've seen, the life of a medieval criminal was often brutish and short, shaped by the harsh realities of poverty, inequality, and a ruthless justice system. But amidst the darkness, there were also flashes of defiance, ingenuity, and even gallantry from those who lived outside the law. Take the case of Adam the Welshman, a wily outlaw who haunted the wilds of northern England in the early 14th century. Born to a poor family in the rugged hills of Wales, Adam turned to a life of crime as a young man, driven by a combination of desperation and thirst for adventure. With a band of loyal followers, Adam made a name for himself as a kind of Robin Hood figure, renowned for his daring heists against wealthy travelers and his generosity to the poor peasants who sheltered him. His exploits became the stuff of folklore. It was said he could disappear into the forest like a ghost, that he had a magic cloak that made him invisible, that he could charm the coins out of any man's purse with his quick wit and silver tongue. But the reality was likely far less romantic. Life on the run was cold, hungry, and perilous. Adam and his men slept rough in the woods, in constant fear of capture. They relied on a network of secret caves and sympathetic villagers to evade the authorities. And when they did strike, it was often with ruthless efficiency, leaving a trail of bodies and terrified survivors in their wake. For years, Adam managed to stay one step ahead of the law, even as his notoriety grew. The local sheriffs put a bounty on his head and hired special constables to track him down. But Adam was a cunning adversary. He bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and eliminated traitors within his own gang to protect himself. However, as with most outlaws, Adam's luck eventually ran out. Betrayed by a jealous lover, he was ambushed by a posse of armed men in a small village where he had gone to visit his mother. A fierce battle ensued, but Adam was severely outnumbered. He was captured and marched back to the nearest town in chains to stand trial. In the makeshift courtroom, Adam stood before the local magistrate, his face bruised and bloodied, his wrists raw from his shackles. The charges against him were read out: murder, robbery, extortion, and an array of other crimes. The crowd that packed the room jeered and hissed, hungry for justice. But even in this dire moment, Adam remained defiant. According to legend, when the magistrate asked him if he had any last words, Adam flashed his trademark grin and quipped, "Aye, my lord, I may hang for my crimes, but at least I had the courage to live free, which is more than I can say for these bootlickers and sycophants you call subjects." The magistrate was not amused. He sentenced Adam to be hanged until dead, his body to be displayed as a warning to other would-be brigands. The execution was carried out swiftly in the town square, attended by a braying mob of peasants and merchants who cheered as the life drained from the outlaw's body. In death, Adam the Welshman passed into legend, the dashing rogue who defied the wealthy and powerful, the merry trickster who eluded capture for so long, the martyr who died a criminal but lived as a free man. Ballads were sung of his exploits for generations, even as the details grew more fanciful with each telling. But for every Adam the Welshman, for every romanticized outlaw hero, there were dozens more petty thieves, cut purses, and highwaymen who met a miserable end with little fanfare. The vast majority of medieval criminals were desperate, damaged souls, pushed to the margins by a brutally unequal society and forced to prey on each other to survive. Take the story of Will Scathlock, a simple cottager from Sussex who, in a fit of drunken rage, bludgeoned his wife to death with a shovel in 1432. A habitual drunkard and a brute, Will was well known in his village for his foul temper and his quick fists. His long-suffering wife, Mary, bore the brunt of his abuse for years until that fateful night when he finally went too far. Realizing what he had done, Will fled into the woods, leaving his wife's broken body for their children to find in the morning. For months, he survived by stealing scraps from rubbish heaps and slaughtered livestock from fields, slowly losing his mind from guilt, paranoia, and starvation. He was finally caught by the local reeve, curled up half dead in a drainage ditch, mumbling incoherently. Hauled before the manor court, he openly confessed to his crime and begged for mercy. But there was no mercy for a wife killer in those days. Will was sentenced to be pressed to death. A slow, agonizing execution where heavy weights were piled on the condemned's chest until they suffocated. As he lay gasping on the ground, feeling his ribs crack and his lungs collapse under the crushing load, Will Scathlock must have reflected on the bleak trajectory of his life, the poverty, the squalor, the constant gnawing hunger in his belly, the anger seething in his heart at a world that had given him nothing but hardship and pain. With his last breath, he rasped out a warning to the gathered crowd. "Beware the demon drink, friends. It made me a monster and brought me to this wretched end." Will Scathlock's story was all too common in an age where grinding poverty, rampant alcoholism, and unchecked domestic violence created a perfect storm of human misery. Like so many of his fellow criminals, Will was a product of his cruel, unforgiving environment, a man whose worst impulses were sharpened to a murderous edge by the daily struggle of medieval life. But there were some who managed to rise above their circumstances and achieve a measure of infamy, if not outright fame, through their audacious crimes. One such figure was Jeanne de Clisson, a 14th century Breton noblewoman turned pirate queen who terrorized the English Channel for over a decade. Jeanne's story began as a fairy tale romance. As a young girl, she was married off to a wealthy Breton lord named Olivier de Clisson. By all accounts, it was a happy union, blessed with several children and a life of luxury and privilege. But their idyllic world was shattered in 1343 when Olivier was captured by the English during the Breton War of Succession and publicly beheaded as a traitor. Jeanne was consumed by grief and rage at the unjust execution of her beloved husband. According to legend, she took her 2 young sons to witness their father's gruesome death, then made them swear a blood oath on his severed head to avenge him. Determined to make the English pay for their crime, Jeanne sold off her estates and used the money to finance a pirate fleet of her own. She had her ships painted black and their sails dyed blood red, earning her the nickname the Lioness of Brittany. With her sons and a crew of bloodthirsty mercenaries, she set out to wreak havoc on English shipping lanes. For 13 years, Jeanne de Clisson was the scourge of the Channel, capturing and pillaging dozens of English merchant vessels. She was renowned for her ruthlessness, personally beheading any English nobleman she captured and hurling their bodies into the sea. Her exploits became so notorious that the English crown put a massive bounty on her head, but she always managed to elude capture. As her pirate career flourished, Jeanne used her wealth to build a network of spies and informants across Europe, funneling vital intelligence to the French king to aid in his war against the English. She even bankrolled several assassination attempts against English nobles, though none were successful. But time and tide wait for no one, not even a pirate queen. As she entered her 50s, Jeanne's health began to fail, and her bloodlust finally cooled. After a particularly harrowing battle in 1356, where she was nearly captured, she decided to retire from piracy and live out her days in quiet obscurity. According to some accounts, Jeanne retreated to a remote castle on the Brittany coast, where she devoted herself to prayer and good works, trying to atone for her violent past. Other tales claim she simply vanished without a trace, her ultimate fate lost to history. Whatever the truth, there is no denying that Jeanne de Clisson lived a remarkable life, even by the turbulent standards of the Middle Ages. She was a woman who defied every convention of her time, a noblewoman who became a criminal, a wife who became a warrior, a mother who became a legend. In many ways, Jeanne's story embodies the strange contradictions of the medieval underworld. the blurring of lines between hero and villain, victim and perpetrator, justice and vengeance. In an age of stark brutality and rampant injustice, perhaps it's no wonder that some turn to crime as a means of asserting their humanity, of seizing some small measure of control over their destiny. As we contemplate these tales of daring outlaws and desperate cutthroats, it's tempting to romanticize their lives, to project our modern sensibilities onto their struggles. But we must remember that the reality of medieval crime was far bleaker than any ballad or legend would have us believe. For every flamboyant bandit king or pirate queen, there were countless anonymous wretches who lived and died in squalor, their brief, miserable lives snuffed out by disease, starvation, or the noose. The vast majority of medieval criminals were not dashing rogues or defiant rebels, but broken souls ground down by poverty, ignorance, and cruelty. And yet, even in the darkest corners of the medieval underworld, there are glimmers of something achingly human. Moments of courage, compassion, and even gallows humor in the face of unimaginable adversity. These were people who, for all their flaws and failings, fought tooth and nail to carve out some small space for themselves in a world that had no place for them. As we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for these long-lost souls, the peasant thieves and vagabond rogues, the highwaymen and cutpurses, the smugglers and pirates, and all the other forgotten outlaws of the Middle Ages. May their restless spirits find some measure of peace in the silence of the grave, and may their stories endure as a testament to the indomitable human will to survive, even in the darkest of times. And so we come to the end of our journey through the shadowy underbelly of medieval Europe. From the blood-soaked fields of England to the storm-tossed coasts of Brittany, we have followed in the footsteps of those who lived and died outside the law, those who dared to defy the harsh dictates of their time. It has been a grim and harrowing tale, to be sure, a catalogue of cruelty, desperation, and violence that speaks to the darkest impulses of the human heart. But it is also a profoundly human story, one that resonates across the centuries and reminds us of the common threads that bind us all. For in the end, are we not all outcasts in our own way? Are we not all struggling to find our place in a world that can seem cold, unfair, and indifferent to our suffering? The medieval criminal, for all his sins and sorrows, is a mirror held up to our own souls, a reminder of our shared frailty and our shared strength. So let us not judge them too harshly, these lost and lawless souls of ages past. Let us instead remember them with empathy and understanding as fellow travelers on the winding road of life. And let us take comfort in the knowledge that, no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn will always come, bringing with it the promise of a new day and a chance to start anew. Rest now, weary traveller, and let the echoes of history lull you into a deep and dreamless sleep. May you find solace in the knowledge that you are not alone, that your struggles and triumphs are woven into the great tapestry of human experience, and may you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face the challenges of your own time with the same courage, resilience, and indomitable spirit that sustained our ancestors through the darkest of ages. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. The outlaws of old bid you peace and rest, until we meet again on the winding road of history. The highway robbery exploits of Jack Cornwall soon became the talk of every tavern and town square across England. Ballads were composed extolling his daring and cunning in outwitting the king's men. But fame is a fickle mistress for an outlaw. The more renowned Jack became, the more urgently the authorities sought to apprehend him. In the summer of 1381, Jack's luck finally ran out. After a daring heist on a tax collector's carriage in Warwickshire, he was betrayed by a member of his own gang for the sizable bounty on his head. The informant led the local sheriff and 24 armed men to Jack's forest hideout, where he was arrested after a brief but fierce scuffle. In chains, Jack was hauled before the King's Justice in London to answer for his litany of crimes against Crown and God. The judge, an ancient, shriveled man with a permanent scowl, was unmoved by Jack's roguish charms. In a severe voice, he sentenced the highwayman to a traitor's death, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in front of a jeering crowd. On the morning of his execution, Jack was dragged from the squalid confines of Newgate Prison to the public gallows at Tyburn. A festive, bloodthirsty mood hung over the thousands of spectators jostling for a better view of the gruesome spectacle to come. Vendors peddled meat pies and ale to the excited mob as Jack was led up the scaffold steps. Filthy and emaciated from weeks in the dungeon, Jack nonetheless flashed his trademark smirk as the executioner fitted the noose around his neck. "No man lives forever," he quipped to the hooting crowd. "I only regret I have but one life to give for my merry old England." At the signal, the trap door swung open and Jack plummeted to the end of the rope with a sharp crack. After strangling for several minutes, his body was cut down, and while still alive, his entrails were pulled from his slit belly as he screamed in agony. Finally, the executioner hacked his body into 4 pieces with an axe to be displayed above the city gates as a grim warning to other would-be outlaws. Jack Cornwall's grisly demise was a reminder of the merciless punishments awaiting those who dared defy the social order in medieval England. For kings and commoners alike, public executions and tortures served as a form of brutal entertainment, as well as an instrument of state terror. Public spectacles of pain and death were considered a vital part of the justice system, a deterrent to crime as much as a means of vengeance. Crowds would gather in a festival-like atmosphere to jeer and laugh as the condemned were subjected to agonizing ordeals before facing the ultimate penalty under the law. For petty crimes like theft, branding was a common punishment. The accused would be held down as a red-hot iron was pressed into the flesh of their hand, face, or chest, leaving them permanently marked as a criminal. Repeat offenders could expect to lose a hand or a foot as punishment. Such mutilations left the convicted as social outcasts, unable to find honest work even if they wanted to reform. More severe crimes called for even ghastlier sentences. Murderers, rapists, and heretics were often sentenced to death by burning at the stake. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post atop a pile of kindling in the town square as crowds looked on. The executioner would set the wood ablaze, and the victim would be slowly consumed by the flames, thrashing and shrieking until they succumbed to the smoke and searing pain. Traitors to the crown could expect the most diabolical fates of all, as Jack Cornwall experienced firsthand. In addition to hanging, drawing, and quartering, some were sentenced to be boiled alive in a cauldron of water, oil, or even molten lead. Their agonized screams would fill the air as their skin sloughed off and their internal organs cooked inside them. Such stomach-churning brutality may seem incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. But in a medieval world plagued by rampant crime, violence, and disorder, horrific public tortures served as a social glue of sorts. They unified the law-abiding against the lawless and created a climate of terror that made defying the authorities unthinkable for most. Of course, not all criminals were caught or punished. Many of the most desperate and daring managed to elude justice, at least for a time. Their stories became the stuff of folklore, a grim fascination for the poor and downtrodden who lived vicariously through their exploits. One such figure was Eustace Folville, the so-called Merry Bandit, who haunted the highways and forests of 14th century Leicestershire. Born into a once prosperous family of landed gentry, Eustace fell on hard times as political intrigues and shifting allegiances cost the Folvilles much of their wealth and status. Facing destitution, Eustace and his brothers took to a life of crime as outlaws in the dense woodlands surrounding their ancestral home, Ashby Folville Manor. But while they were motivated by desperation, The Folville gang soon discovered they had a knack for the bandits' trade. Clad in Lincoln green and armed with longbows and broadswords, Eustace and his men would lay in wait along lonely forest roads. When wealthy travellers or cargo wagons came into view, the band would spring from the greenwood bawling lusty war cries. Stunned and outnumbered, most victims quickly surrendered their coin and goods. Those who resisted could expect a swift arrow to the chest or a crushing blow from a quarterstaff. But Eustace was said to forbid his men from harming women, children, or penniless peasants. Indeed, he became something of a local Robin Hood figure, famous for his gallantry and generosity to the poor. According to legend, Eustace once waylaid the carriage of a foppish bishop, travelling through Charnwood Forest with a cargo of silver plate and jewel-encrusted reliquaries. Disguised as a simple woodcutter, Eustace led the pompous prelate into the outlaw's trap, then forced him at sword point to hand over his treasures and consume a supper of humble bacon, beans, and black bread. Eustace then let the red-faced bishop go with a playful swat on the rear from his broadsword and a stern warning to mend his greedy ways. For the rest of his days, the clergyman was said to leave a place at his banquet table for any poor stranger who might pass by seeking alms or a meal. Such chivalrous capers earned Eustace the admiration of the peasantry and the ire of the authorities in equal measure. Ballads and poems celebrating his exploits spread his fame far and wide. But they also drew the attention of the Sheriff of Nottingham, who became determined to bring the Folville gang to justice. The net of the law gradually tightened around the outlaws. Several bloody skirmishes erupted between the bandits and the sheriff's men in the forest, leaving dead and wounded on both sides. Eustace himself barely escaped capture more than once, melting like a ghost into the misty greenwood as pursuers blundered by yards away. But Eustace Folville's freewheeling bandit life could not last forever. After a long manhunt, he was finally cornered at a remote inn and arrested after a brief but fierce sword fight left him wounded and exhausted. Tried and convicted of a laundry list of crimes, Eustace was sentenced to death by hanging at Nottingham Castle. According to some accounts, he was offered a last-minute pardon if he agreed to reveal the whereabouts of his buried loot. "Keep your pardon," Eustace reportedly scoffed, "for I've lived as a free man, and I'll die as one. Let the poor keep what I've given them, and be glad of it." With those defiant words, Eustace Folville stepped bravely onto the gallows trapdoor and plunged to his death, entering the realm of legend as surely as any figure from the misty past. His short, merry life and violent end embodied the brutal realities and romantic ideals of the medieval outlaw in equal measure. Of course, the experiences of male outlaws like Eustace Folville tell only part of the story of medieval crime and punishment. For women in the Middle Ages, the justice system could be even more cruel and unforgiving. The Pat. As we've seen, the brutal realities of medieval crime and punishment were intimately intertwined with the harsh social conditions of the time. Grinding poverty, unchecked disease, and a rigid class hierarchy pushed many to the margins of society, where a life of crime offered the only hope of survival. In this unforgiving world, even petty offences could result in horrific torture and gruesome public execution as the ruling class sought to maintain order through terror. One of the most iconic figures of the medieval underworld was the highwayman, a daring bandit who lay in wait along the lonely roads to ambush unsuspecting travellers. These desperate outlaws came from all walks of life, driven to crime by circumstance and opportunity. Some were fallen nobles or disgraced knights, others simple peasants or fugitive serfs seeking to escape the crushing burdens of feudal servitude. Perhaps no highwayman embodied this archetype more than the infamous Jack Cornwall, whose blood-soaked exploits struck fear into the hearts of wealthy merchants and clerics across 14th century England. Born into grinding poverty, Jack watched helplessly as his family's meagre farm was seized by the local lord for failure to pay taxes. With nothing left to lose, he took to the highways with a small band of fellow outcasts, determined to exact revenge on the system that had stripped him of land and livelihood. For years, Jack and his gang terrorized the roads of southern England, targeting rich pilgrims, tax collectors, and noble retinues flush with valuables. Cloaked by darkness and the thick forests lining the muddy thoroughfares, they would spring from concealment, swords drawn and faces masked, to quickly overwhelm their startled quarry. Those who surrendered were often roughed up and robbed blind, their coin purses and jewels ripped away to fill the bandits' coffers. But anyone who dared resist could expect a swift and bloody end on the edge of Jack's merciless blade. As their notoriety grew, Jack's band soon attracted scores of the region's poor and dispossessed, swelling their ranks and allowing them to attempt even bolder heists. Dodging the patrols of the local sheriffs and ducking in and out of forest sanctuaries, they ran a sly guerrilla campaign that made them folk heroes to the downtrodden peasantry. Songs and stories spread of Jack Cornwall's cunning exploits and his knack for humiliating the haughty elite, even as he fattened the purses of widows and orphans with his spoils. But no outlaw could escape justice forever in medieval England, where the crown was determined to make grisly examples of all who challenged its power. After one daring raid too many, Jack and his men were finally surrounded by a vast posse of sheriffs, hunters, and night trackers, all eager to collect the sizable bounty on the highwaymen's heads. In the fierce battle that followed, most of the gang was cut down in a desperate last stand. A wounded Jack managed to slip away into a nearby bog, but his freedom was short-lived. Feverish and weak from loss of blood, he was discovered unconscious by hounds and hauled in chains to the Tower of London to await the King's justice. Crowds thronged the muddy square on the day of Jack's execution, eager for the morbid spectacle of a celebrity criminal's demise. Hauled before the jeering mob, an emaciated Jack was made to endure one last ordeal, his crimes read out by a sneering bailiff over the catcalls and rotten produce hurled by the audience. The sentence was as swift as it was brutal, drawing and quartering, the grisly fate reserved for only the most notorious traitors to the crown. As the executioner sharpened his blades and the cart trundled forward to the site of butchery, Jack Cornwall reportedly turned to his captors with a sly grin, quipping, "I only ever fought for my share of the world's plenty, same as any lord or bishop. Perhaps in death, I'll find the justice so lacking in this life." Whether Jack truly uttered such words, we'll never know. But in that final sardonic defiance, he crystallized the spirit of the medieval outlaw, a rebel to the last against the suffocating strictures of his time. With a nod, Jack commended his soul to God as the horses strained forward and the first cuts bit deep. In an explosion of blood and agony, one of the most legendary highwaymen of the Middle Ages was ripped asunder, his head deftly shorn off by the axeman to join the other grinning skulls atop London Bridge. The pieces of his body were sent to the four corners of the realm as a hideous warning to any who dared follow his example. Yet Jack's memory would long outlive his mutilated remains, whispered in taverns and roadside inns, as a folk hero cut down by the ruthless powers that be. In this telling, his death was not a defeat, but an apotheosis, an immortal rebuke from beyond the grave to the bloated lords and clerics who grew fat on the suffering of the poor. While Jack Cornwall's tale is certainly one of the more colourful in the annals of medieval crime, it reflects the dismal fates that awaited most who ran afoul of the law in this era. The brutality of the highwayman's trade was more than matched by the savagery of the punishments dispensed to those who got caught. In a time before standing police forces or professional jailers, justice retained the primal simplicity of tooth and claw, striking mortal terror into would-be malefactors with the grisly spectacle of public execution and torture. Across medieval Europe, town squares and castle courtyards routinely played host to the stomach-churning theatrics of criminal sentencing, as crowds bayed for blood and pulpits rang with stern imprecations. Thick-necked executioners plied their trade with workmanlike gusto, turning living transgressors into object lessons in the certainty of divine judgment and royal retribution. The methods employed spanned a skin-crawling array of brutality and fatal ingenuity, all carefully calibrated to deliver maximum suffering and ignominy to the condemned. For pettier crimes like poaching, scolding, or public drunkenness, miscreants might be locked into the stocks or pillory, wooden restraints that held head and hands fast for the gleeful abuse of the masses. With arms and noggin helplessly fixed in place, offenders were forced to endure a barrage of jeers, chamber pot slops, and mouldering produce for hours or even days, the rotting detritus seeping into eyes and clotting hair until their release left them stumbling, half-blind and reeking. More serious infractions like burglary, forgery, or sodomy saw the guilty subjected to agonizing public floggings and mutilations, with bare backs flayed to gory ribbons by the lead-tipped cat o' nine tails and noses or ears deftly shorn away by a razor-edged dirk. Thieves and pickpockets were often branded on hand or forehead with a sizzling iron, leaving them permanently scarred as pariahs to be shunned by the honest for fear of guilt by association. But even these grim ordeals paled before the dark creativity unleashed upon perpetrators of the most heinous crimes: treason, heresy, witchcraft, and murder. For these transgressors, the cunning torturers of the Middle Ages dreamed up a hellscape of exquisite agonies designed to inflict maximal suffering and ignominy before death's sweet release. Some, like Jack Cornwall, were drawn and quartered, lashed spread-eagled between four straining horses until their joints cracked and flesh peeled away in gory strips. Others suffered the red-hot pincers and tongs of branding, their skin crisping and bubbling as the unyielding metal seared deep. Many were broken on the wheel, their limbs hammered and splintered between the spokes, until only a twitching sack of pulverized flesh remained. Witches and heretics burned at the stake, writhing and wailing as the flames consumed hair, skin, and fat in greasy gouts of smoke. Perhaps most fiendish of all was the practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved for only the vilest enemies of crown and church. In this grotesque ritual, the condemned would first be half strangled by the noose, leaving them twitching and purpled, but still agonizingly conscious. Then, as a sharp-bladed dirk plunged into their belly to spill steaming guts onto the scaffold, they were swiftly emasculated, the offending organs thrust into the bubbling mass. Finally, in an explosion of gore and viscera, the executioner's axe severed head from shoulders, releasing the criminal's tormented soul to whatever hellish judgment awaited. Such stomach-churning scenes played out with grim regularity across the mud and blood-splattered courtyards of medieval Europe. They served as a potent reminder of the utter brutality that awaited any who threatened the feudal order or ran afoul of the harsh, unforgiving codes of the time. In an age where life was already nasty, brutish, and short for all but society's upper crust, these gruesome spectacles sought to cow the masses into submission with the promise of even greater agonies for those who stepped out of line. Yet even amidst the cruelty and squalor of the Middle Ages, there were some who managed to rise above the muck and blood to achieve a sort of transgressive glamour. These were the dashing outlaws and gentlemen highwaymen who robbed from the rich to give to the poor, their exploits celebrated in song and story, long after the noose or axe blade claimed their necks. Bridging the gap between common cutpurse and romantic renegade, these merry men represented a tantalizing fantasy of rebellion against the suffocating strictures of feudal society. One of the most fabled of these figures was Eustace Foleville, the daring bandit and hood-clad scourge of 14th century Leicestershire. Born the youngest son of a respectable gentry family, Eustace seemed destined for a life of rural obscurity, another generation to work the land and uphold the family name. But a taste for wine, women, and wanderlust saw him cast out from hearth and home to make his fortune on the highways and byways of England. Blessed with a smooth tongue and a roguish charm, Eustace soon gathered a band of like-minded adventurers, recruiting from the ranks of poachers, deserters, and fugitive peasants. Clad in Lincoln green and armed with longbows and broadswords, Foleville's merry men prowled the great forests of the Midlands, lying in wait for plump merchant caravans and lumbering tax collectors. With a twang of bowstrings and a flash of steel, they would relieve their unlucky quarry of coin, silver plate, and the occasional comely daughter, all while leaving the poor and downtrodden conspicuously unmolested. As word of their exploits spread, Eustace and his men soon became folk heroes to the region's put-upon peasantry. Tales circulated of the gallant highwaymen who served as a thorn in the side of the local lords and bishops, audaciously robbing the rich to fatten the thin purses of widows and orphans. Balladeers sang of Foleville's uncanny knack for slipping the noose, foiling the bumbling sheriff of Nottingham with quick wits and quicker feet. Beleaguered serfs marvelled at a bandit chieftain who not only thrashed the elites at every turn, but looked damn good doing it, all flashing eyes and impudent moustaches beneath that jaunty hood. But even Eustace's luck could not hold forever against the rising ire of the crown. After one caper too many saw the gang making off with the golden candlesticks of the Abbot of Leicester, the king himself dispatched a picked force of knights and huntsmen to run the outlaws to ground. Foleville and his men made a daring last stand amidst the tangled oaks of Charnwood Forest, their longbows thrumming and sword arms flashing crimson in the dappled light. In the end, though, the odds were too long, even for such storied rogues. A bloodied Eustace was dragged in chains before the scowling abbot to face the king's justice, a highwayman and rabble-rouser too dangerous to be left alive. Yet standing in the shadow of the gallows, he reportedly flashed his captors a devil-may-care grin, jauntily quipping, "I regret only that I have but one neck to give for the poor and downtrodden of this realm." Such insouciance in the face of doom only added to Foleville's legend, a rakish rebel who flew in the face of death, just as he'd tweaked the nose of privilege in life. In the wake of Eustace's execution, the crown took ruthless steps to suppress any further banditry, unleashing a wave of gibbets and dungeons to cow the simmering unrest. Yet Foleville's memory proved harder to erase than his fleshly remains. For generations after, local peasants continued to whisper his exploits over evening ales, painting the dashing highwayman as a fallen hero of the forest, a merry avenger cut down by the bloated lords and bishops. In death as in life, Eustace had slipped beyond the reach of mere temporal authority to live on in the popular imagination. While Eustace Foleville and his ilk offered a romanticized vision of resistance to the feudal order, the realities of life for most medieval criminals were far grimmer, especially for women. In a deeply patriarchal society where females were seen as little more than chattel, the justice system reserved particular brutality and scorn for women who stepped outside the suffocating confines of home and hearth. Even petty offences that might earn a man a day in the stocks could see a woman savagely whipped or disfigured. A female scold or gossip would be denounced as a noisy nuisance and a blight upon the parish, before being subjected to the dehumanizing torture of the scold's bridle, or branks. This fiendish contraption featured a spiked metal cage that locked around the offender's head, with a serrated iron bit shoved into the mouth to still the shrewish tongue within. Paraded through the streets like a mad dog, the bridled woman served as a warning to any who dared disturb the peace with idle prattle. More serious transgressions invited even harsher retribution from the paternalistic hand of the law. A woman caught thieving or whoring might have her nose or ears shorn clean away, a permanent disfiguring mark of shame to accompany her every public foray. Pregnancy out of wedlock was treated as a moral abomination, with unwed mothers subjected to savage floggings and confinement in grim Magdalene laundries, breaking their backs to scrub away their sins. But perhaps no crime invited more misogynistic hysteria than the supposed practice of witchcraft. In a world haunted by disease, crop failures, and the ever-present spectre of Satan, solitary women on the margins of society were easy scapegoats for all manner of misfortune. Midwives, healers, widows, any female who dared live outside male control and sanction was vulnerable to the ominous finger of accusation. Once denounced, an alleged witch could expect no mercy from the snarling male authorities. Stripped and shaved, she would be pricked mercilessly for the supposed devil's mark, any blemish or mole seized on as proof of her compact with Satan. Stretched on the rack or crushed beneath piling stones, many would confess to any absurdity, spinning tales of midnight sabbats and carnal congress with the horned one to put an end to their torment. For those who still refused to repent, only the purifying flames of the stake awaited. Across Europe, tens of thousands of women were lashed to pyres and set alight, their blackened bodies crumbling to ash as jeering crowds howled for the destruction of Satan's sluts. In the tortured imaginings of celibate clerics and jealous inquisitors, the witch served as the ultimate spectre of unruly female sexuality, a demonic temptress in league with the devil who threatened to castrate and unman her pious accusers. Such was the dismal and deadly fate that awaited any woman who dared to defy the crushing patriarchy of the Middle Ages. Whether driven by poverty, passion, or simply a desire to exist beyond the suffocating bonds of marriage and motherhood, those who strayed faced a pitiless reckoning from both state and church. Their suffering served as a potent reminder of the unrelenting misogyny that plagued even the most progressive precincts of medieval Europe. Of course, not all the scandals of the age swirled around society's outcasts and dregs. Even the most exalted and sacred of institutions was not immune to the sins of greed, lust, and abuse so rampant in the feudal order. Indeed, the late Middle Ages saw the once unassailable authority of the Catholic Church increasingly tarnished by breathtaking corruption and debauchery within its ranks. Far from the shepherds of Christ's earthly flock, all too many medieval clerics seemed to take their model from a very different biblical figure: the money changers, whom Jesus dramatically expelled from the temple. Bloated bishops and corpulent cardinals openly trafficked in ecclesiastical offices, selling choice positions to the highest buy. Content warning. This script contains some descriptions of violence and brutality in a historical context. As we've seen, the crushing inequality and desperation of medieval life pushed many to the fringes of society and into a life of crime. With no formal police force and only sporadic military patrols, the highways and byways of Europe became the haunts of bandits and brigands preying on travellers. One such highwayman was Jack Cornwall, a farmer turned outlaw in the 14th century England. Born to an impoverished peasant family, Jack grew up in a crumbling hovel, his belly often aching with hunger. As a young man, he dutifully worked the fields of the local lord, breaking his back for meagre wages that could barely feed his wife and children. After a series of bad harvests and harsh winters, Jack's family faced starvation. In desperation, he took to the road, determined to do whatever it took to fill their bellies. He began waylaying travellers in the dense forests, demanding their coin at knife point. Though terrified at first, he soon found he had a talent for the outlaw's life. His quick wit and silver tongue helped him relieve many a fat merchant or haughty noble of their purses without resorting to violence. Jack's reputation as a gentleman thief quickly spread, and he recruited other desperate men to join his band. They became the scourge of the highways, striking fast and vanishing into the greenwood. But for all his charms, Jack was still a hunted man. The local sheriff, humiliated by his inability to catch the wily bandit, put a steep price on his head. Late one autumn night, as Jack and his men caroused at a lonely inn, the sheriff's soldiers burst in. A vicious brawl erupted, but the brigands were outmatched. Jack was shackled and dragged off to the dungeons, where he was tortured mercilessly to reveal the location of his loot. Beaten but defiant, Jack faced the magistrate with a wry smile, quipping, "I regret only that I have but one neck to give for my starving bairns." Unamused, the judge sentenced him to a grisly public execution. Before a jeering crowd, Jack was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his head mounted on a pike as a grim warning to other would-be highwaymen. Such brutal punishments were all too common in the Middle Ages, a time when justice was harsh and often horrifically violent. Authorities believed that only the most visceral, agonizing tortures and humiliating public spectacles could deter the desperate poor from crime. For petty theft, a criminal might be flogged until the skin hung from their back in bloody strips, or have a hand lopped off as a permanent mark of shame. Tongues were cut out for blasphemy, eyes gouged out for spying. The most serious offences warranted fiendishly creative punishments to inflict maximum suffering. Murderers and rebels were hung in iron gibbets, their bodies left to bloat and blacken in the sun as crows pecked out their eyes. Heretics and witches were burned alive at the stake, their screams echoing over the sobs and prayers of the bloodthirsty crowd. Traitors suffered the long, excruciating death of hanging, drawing, and quartering, dangled by the neck, cut down still alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and hacked into pieces. But perhaps no sight provoked more dread than the dungeon, that lightless stone pit where the condemned awaited their grotesque fates. Imagine the terror of being dragged down into that fetid hole, shackled to the slime-slick walls, forgotten by all but the rats and the merciless jailers. The reek of filth and fear would choke your nostrils as you listened to the ragged moans of your fellow prisoners, wasting away from starvation or gangrene. Many never even lived to see their execution day, succumbing to disease, torture, or despair. In some castles, you can still tour those medieval dungeons today, if you have the stomach for it. The cold, damp air seems to whisper with centuries of suffering. Etched into the stone walls, you'll find tally marks scratched by prisoners marking their interminable days, fragments of desperate prayers, even the occasional crude joke. Gallows humour, you might say. One night, Robert of Alton left behind an entire autobiography in his cell as he awaited execution for murder in the 1290s. Once a minor noble and celebrated tournament champion, Robert's downfall began when he ran a man through in a tavern brawl. He escaped the scene, but quickly discovered life as a fugitive suited him. He rampaged across England for months, robbing and killing with little remorse. When finally captured, after a sword fight with the sheriff's men left him bleeding and delirious, Robert faced the certainty of a brutal death. With little else to occupy him in the dungeon, he began to pen his life story on mouldering scraps of parchment. In it, he attempts to justify his actions, painting himself as a man more sinned against than sinning. He spills much ink on his ill treatment by a world he feels has betrayed him. The scorns of women, the slights from other knights, the crushing debt that led him to crime. It reads in places like the self-pitying rants of a violent narcissist. But as his execution looms, the tone shifts. He reflects with growing horror on the trail of bodies and broken lives he's left in his wake. In the final pages, Robert writes of dark nights of the soul, his armour of anger finally cracking to expose the frightened child within. He begs for God's forgiveness, wishing he could wash his hands of all the blood. Knowing that he can't, he only prays that his death may serve as a warning to other angry young men. It is a haunting reminder of the thin line between outlaw and hero, monster and man. Of course, not everyone who ran afoul of medieval law was a brawling drunkard or cold-blooded killer. The Middle Ages were a time of few rights and freedoms, especially for women and the poor. A peasant girl might be flogged for the crime of fornication while a noblewoman who murdered her abusive husband would be burned at the stake for petty treason. Those who spoke out against the all-powerful church could be branded heretics and tortured into recanting. Even within the church, vice and corruption festered behind a facade of piety. In 1390, a scandal rocked London when a surprise inspection found the monks of Sion Abbey drunkenly cavorting with prostitutes in their quarters. The abbot and his clerics had been running a brothel out of the monastery for years, pocketing the profits while preaching celibacy. Such hypocrisy was all too common in a time when religious authority went unchecked. Other men of the cloth strayed even further from the path of righteousness. The defrocked monk Honorius of Autumn roamed the French countryside in the 1180s, seducing and swindling widows out of their inheritance. When his holy habits failed to persuade, he turned to poisons and dark magics to bewitch his marks. After 2 decades of debauchery, Honorius's wickedness finally caught up with him, and he was captured, unmasked as a Satanist and burned for heresy. But perhaps no medieval criminals have loomed so large in the popular imagination as the dashing highwaymen and gallant outlaws. Men like Eustace Folville, the gentleman robber who bedeviled the wealthy of Leicestershire in the 1320s. A minor noble from a once great family, Eustace turned to a life of crime after his inheritance was unjustly seized by unscrupulous rivals. Rather than let his family name founder in obscurity, he gathered a band of loyal retainers and took to ambushing the tax collectors and wealthy travellers of the realm. But Eustace was no common thug. He saw himself as a righter of wrongs, robbing from the rich and powerful to help the poor and downtrodden. After a successful heist, he was known to throw lavish feasts in the greenwood for the starving peasantry. His gallantry and generosity made Eustace a folk hero among the common people, who shielded him from the sheriff's men. Ballads and poems sprang up extolling his virtues, casting him as a merry prankster and wily charmer. According to legend, he could evade any trap, disguising himself as a leper, a friar, or even a comely maiden to slip past his pursuers. Some tales even paint him as a kind of Cupid, using his ill-gotten gold to dower penniless brides and unite star-crossed lovers. But in truth, Eustace's story is likely far less romantic. He and his men left a trail of bloodshed across the Midlands, and their crimes were seldom as discriminating as the ballads would have you believe. But in a time of unchecked greed and corruption, perhaps it's no wonder that people looked for heroes among the outlaws. These daring rogues and desperate peasants, wicked priests and penitent killers may have been buried long ago in unmarked graves, but their stories echo still through history. In their brutal lives, we catch a glimpse of a world with little pity for the poor and powerless, where any slip could spell disaster and even small crimes were punished without mercy. But we see, too, the spark of relatable humanity in even the lowest villain, the every person pushed to desperation by an uncaring world, the outlaw revolutionary striving to balance the scales of justice, the regretful sinner seeking redemption in his final hour. While we may shudder at their baser deeds, we can't help but feel a twinge of recognition at their all-too-human foibles and yearnings. In the final reckoning, perhaps what fascinates us most about the criminals of ages past is the mirror they hold up to our own society. How far have we really come from a world where the poor are driven to desperation, the powerful can evade justice, and a person's worth is weighted by accidents of birth and fortune? Perhaps in our morbid curiosity lingers the uneasy knowledge that, but for a trick of history, we might have found ourselves in the same wretched dungeons, our own follies and trespasses etched into the walls. But as we lie here in the comfort of our beds, the soft glow of our night lights holding the shadows at bay, we can be grateful that those brutal days are long behind us. A nightmare from which we've mercifully awoken. The outlaws and cutthroats of old have been laid to rest. Their grisly fates are fading memory. In our kinder, gentler world, justice is tempered with mercy, and even the lowest among us can hope for a measure of dignity. So let us spare a moment's somber thought for those unfortunate enough to have been born in crueler times, when life was often nasty, brutish, and short. But let us, too, take comfort in the distance we've come and the better angels of our nature that light the way forward. And with that, I bid you good night and sweet dreams, secure in the knowledge that the horrors of history are but a shadow to the progress of today. Sleep well. As the sun set over the thatched roofs and cobblestone streets of medieval England, the shadows grew long and ominous. For the poorest peasants scratching out a meagre living, each day was a struggle to survive, let alone stay on the right side of the law. Desperate times often called for desperate measures. One such desperate soul was Jack Cornwall, a humble turnip farmer from the windswept moors of Devon. Jack had always been a simple, law-abiding man, content to till his small plot of rocky soil and provide for his family as best he could. But the summer of 1352 changed everything. That fateful year, the rains failed and Jack's crops withered in the fields. His infant son fell ill with a fever and wasted away before his eyes. And when he could not pay his annual tithe to the local monastery, the abbot's thugs burned his barn to the ground as punishment, with his last scrawny ox trapped inside. Faced with ruin and starvation, something snapped inside Jack Cornwall. He took to the highways with a stout oak staff, determined to take back from the wealthy a small measure of what had been stolen from him. By the pale moonlight, he lay in wait, his rangy figure cloaked in a mouldy black hood. At first, Jack held up solitary travellers for their purses and jewels, his face hidden and his rough voice quaking with adrenaline. But as his confidence grew, so did his audacity. He graduated to ambushing merchant caravans, making off with whole cartloads of riches. The people of Devon began to whisper of a dark figure haunting the moors. The hooded demon, they called him. No one knew his true identity. Some said he could melt into the shadows, that he sold his soul to the devil for unholy powers. Others claimed he had a band of followers, an army of beggars and outlaws terrorizing travellers across the Shire. Such wild rumours were far from the truth, but Jack Cornwall did little to dispel them. In fact, the sinister mythos growing around him only made his job easier, as fear-stricken victims put up less of a fight. The hooded demon's midnight tolls became almost routine, but the highwayman's charmed luck could not last forever. In the wee hours one November night, Jack lay in wait as an opulent carriage trundled up the forest road, its noble passenger no doubt weighed down with gold and jewels. Brandishing a rusty blade, he leapt out to accost his prize, only to freeze at the steely shriek of a dozen swords unsheathing around him. It was a trap. The carriage rumbled off down the road untouched as the local sheriff's men swarmed out of the trees. Jack was beaten to the ground before he could even utter a threat, his face mashed into the freezing mud as shackles snapped shut around his wrists. The hooded demon's reign of terror was over. Word of the notorious highwayman's capture raced across Devon. In every tavern and town square, people buzzed with lurid rumours about the hooded demon's true identity and the terrible fate that awaited him. Most assumed he would hang before the week was out. But the sheriff had a crueler punishment in mind. To make an example of this brazen outlaw who had terrorised his lands, he ordered the prisoner publicly gibbeted, left to die of exposure in an iron cage hung from a crossroads gallows, his wretched body picked apart by ravens as a warning to all who would defy the law. Jack Cornwall's trial was a swift and one-sided affair, a mere formality in the eyes of the court. Still bruised and bloodied from his capture, he was dragged before the bailiff in chains, a rotten cabbage bouncing off his head as the crowd jeered his ragged appearance. The sheriff laid out the charges: highway robbery, assault, Satan worship, sedition. Jack protested that he was a humble farmer, driven to desperation after a run of misfortune that was no fault of his own. But his words fell on deaf ears, and when the bailiff asked if any would speak in the prisoner's defense, he was answered only by a stony silence. Faced with a table laden with the jewels and silks he had stolen, Jack Cornwall could mount no meaningful defense. The hooded outlaw could only hang his head as the bailiff declared him guilty on all charges and handed down his sentence, death by gibbeting, to be carried out at dawn. A chorus of gleeful hoots and hollers rose from the mob as Jack was roughly bundled out of the courthouse. Hands bound behind him, he stumbled through the muddy streets as packs of children darted out to pelt him with dung and rotted fruit, braying like donkeys at his humiliation. Soon enough, the grim silhouette of the gallows loomed above him, its gibbets creaking mournfully in the whistling wind. A palpable hush fell over the mob as they parted to let Jack pass, their faces upturned in apprehensive anticipation. Even those who had bayed loudest for his blood felt a twinge of unease at the sight of those rusted cages swaying beneath the crossbeam. With the halting steps of a man mounting his own funeral pyre, Jack Cornwall ascended the weather-beaten scaffold. In the half-light before dawn, his gaunt features took on a sepulchral aspect, as if he were already more spectre than man. The sheriff's men had to lift his limp form into the cramped iron cage bolted to the gallows frame. As the bailiff began to read out the formal declaration of execution, Jack raised his matted head to take one last look at the world that had brought him to this fate. But when he beheld the sea of faces gazing up at him, their features warped by a mix of pity, disgust, and morbid fascination, he could not help but bark out a bitter laugh at the cruel irony of it all. These were the same downtrodden wretches he had seen begging in the gutters, the gaunt women in tattered smocks, and the stooped old men with hands gnarled by a lifetime of thankless toil. The people whose misery and desperation he knew all too well. For had he not been one of them himself before he dared to strike back against the merciless boot of fate upon his neck? In that moment, Jack Cornwall felt nothing but a weary resignation, an acceptance that this wicked world would always crush men like him. As the bolts slammed shut on his gibbet with a resounding clang, he had no energy left to rage against his lot. Head lolling against the rusted bars of his final resting place, he let his eyes flutter closed as the last words of his sentence echoed across the silent square. Shall be left here to perish and rot as a warning to all cut purses, brigands, and enemies of the king's peace. May God have mercy on his wretched soul. The mob lingered for a time, craning their necks and murmuring to each other as they waited to see if the condemned man would stir. But Jack Cornwall hung as lifeless as a marionette with its strings cut. The slow rise and fall of his chest, the only sign he still clung to life. One by one, the townspeople drifted away to begin their days, the excitement of the execution already fading into memory. The children scampered off to chase each other through the muddy lanes, their shrieks of laughter soon ringing out across the misty hills. The baker on the corner stoked his ovens to blazing life, and the scent of fresh bread began to waft through the stirring streets. And on the gallows hill, the hooded demon sat caged and alone, shivering in the chill as he stared out through dead man's eyes at the world that had defeated him. The life he had known already seemed little more than a half-remembered dream. The man he had been fading like mist under a merciless sun. All that remained was the hooded outlaw, broken and bound in his iron cage, waiting only for the merciful oblivion of death. Jack Cornwall's public torment stretched on for 3 miserable days and nights. The skies wept an icy rain as he huddled against the gnawing cold, soaked to the bone in his rotting rags. Hunger and thirst clawed at his belly with ravenous talons. Sallow-faced urchins took to gathering beneath his perch, taunting him with cruel japes and jeers. "Demon! Demon!" they shrieked with malicious glee, cavorting about the gallows as they dared each other to poke his bony limbs with long sticks. Even the local dogs came to yap at his heels, baring their yellow teeth with hackles raised. Through it all, Jack could only groan piteously in his cage, eyes rolling back in sunken sockets as he shuddered against the bars. At times he slipped into a delirious fog, gibbering nonsense at the cackling ravens that circled ever closer. Death would have been a mercy. But even in his lowest moments, slumped senseless and soaked in his own filth, Jack Cornwall clung stubbornly to life. The embers of his defiant spirit still smouldered deep within, refusing to grant his tormentors the satisfaction of a swift surrender. And as minutes stretched into hours and hours into days, the hooded prisoner persisted in his iron cage. The spectacle soon began to lose its savage thrill. The children lost interest and drifted away to other amusements, and even the bailiff tired of standing guard over a single sorry outlaw hanging catatonic from the gibbet. On the morning of the fourth day, no one even bothered to glance up as they passed under the shadow of the gallows. When the end finally came for Jack Cornwall, only the howling wind and a lone raven perched high above bore witness. With a last rattling gasp, the hooded demon slipped his mortal chains and drifted off to whatever uncertain fate awaits brigands and outcasts in the next world. And so he hung, rigid and lifeless, until the bailiff's men finally cut him down and dumped his wasted corpse in an unmarked grave at the crossroads. The story of Jack Cornwall, the haunted highwayman of Devon, was not a particularly remarkable one in his day and age. Countless other desperate men took to the roads to prey on their fellow man, driven by gnawing poverty or simple greed. Public executions were a grimly routine spectacle in market squares across the land. And yet something about the hooded demon's wretched end seemed to resonate with the common folk who had watched him meet his grisly fate. In the years that followed, children continued to invoke the caged phantom of the crossroads gallows to frighten each other, daring their playmates to go and spit on the spot where he was buried after dark. Travellers still shuddered and crossed themselves as they hurried past that crumbling landmark, whispering their prayers that Jack Cornwall's unquiet ghost would not reach out to drag them back to the hell he knew so well. His bleak story of a broken man pushed past all endurance lived on, passed down in creaking tavern tales and shivering whispers for generations to come. To the downtrodden and desperate, the hooded demon became a sort of twisted folk hero, a spectre of gallows-hung vengeance against the rich and mighty, however hopeless his stand had been. They raised toasts to old Jack Cornwall's memory and hummed darkly jaunty ballads about the scourge of the highways, even as they prayed their own lives would never follow his dismal path. And on chill November nights, when the skittering leaves sound like bony fingers scraping across bare branches, some folks still shuddered and peered warily over their shoulders as they scurried home through the gloom, half convinced they had caught a glimpse of a ragged black hood lurking at the crossroads up ahead, waiting to waylay the unwary. But the truth, of course, was that nothing remained of Jack Cornwall save a few yellowed bones mouldering beneath the weathered gallows hill. The man himself had been all too mortal, ground to dust between the merciless gears of his age. In that, at least, his short and brutal story was all too common, a glimpse into the miserable lives of the faceless thousands condemned by fickle fate to suffer and perish as penniless criminals, unmourned and unremembered. Welcome back, dear listener, to our immersive journey through the dark underbelly of medieval crime and punishment. As we continue our exploration, we find ourselves in the fetid alleys and seedy taverns frequented by society's most disreputable characters. Picture a dimly lit, ramshackle inn on the outskirts of 14th century London. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and simmering stew of questionable origin. Huddled around a rough-hewn table in the corner, a group of unsavoury men converse in hushed tones, their faces obscured by hoods and flickering candlelight. These are the members of the notorious Folville gang, a band of aristocratic outlaws who have turned to a life of crime. At the head of the table sits their charismatic leader, Eustace Folville. Tall and lean with piercing blue eyes, Eustace cuts a dashing figure in his fine woolen cloak and tall leather boots. Born into a wealthy landowning family, Eustace had every opportunity for a life of privilege and comfort. But a taste for adventure and a hatred for injustice led him down a far different path. As Eustace sips from a flagon of mead, he recounts their latest daring exploit to his eager men. "Lads," he grins roguishly, "that fat tax collector didn't know what hit him. His purse was fatter than a Christmas goose." The men guffaw and clink their tankards in approval. You see, in an age of rampant corruption and inequality, Eustace fancied himself a champion of the common man. He and his band of merry men would lie in wait along lonely forest roads, ambushing wealthy merchants and government officials. But rather than keep the spoils for themselves, Eustace insisted they distribute the loot among the grateful peasantry. "Aye, you should have seen the looks on them villagers' faces," chuckles one scruffy outlaw. "'Twas like Father Christmas himself had come." Of course, the authorities took a far dimmer view of the Folville gang's redistribution of wealth. They were wanted men with hefty bounties on their heads. But Eustace's cunning and local popularity always kept him one step ahead of the sheriff's men. The Folville gang's exploits soon became the stuff of legend, celebrated in ballads and folklore. Tales spread of their daring daylight robberies and Eustace's incredible feats of archery. According to one story, a pursuing posse had Eustace surrounded and trapped up a tree. But the wily rogue simply leapt from the branches onto his waiting horse and galloped away to freedom, laughing heartily. But life as a medieval outlaw was still fraught with peril, however romanticized. Violent clashes with soldiers, desperate flights from the law, and the ever-present threat of betrayal were sobering realities. And if captured, a brutal public execution doubtlessly awaited, with one's name recorded as a villain for the ages. As our scene in the tavern winds down, Eustace and his gang slip out into the misty night to plan their next caper. Little could they know their legendary run would last only a few more months before a fateful final encounter with the sheriff's forces. But that, dear listener, is a harrowing tale for another time. For now, let us take a moment to reflect on the Folville gang and what their controversial crimes reveal about the Robin Hood figures who arose in times of great oppression and inequity. Men like Eustace were heroes to some, reviled criminals to others, and perhaps a bit of both. Their stories continue to fascinate us centuries later and offer a window into the complex social landscape of the medieval world. But now, the hour grows late and the candle burns low. Rest your weary head and let the misty forests and daring outlaws of yore fade into the soft embrace of slumber. In our next episode, we'll explore the harsh fates of female criminals in the Middle Ages and some scandalous tales of misbehaving nuns. Until then, good night and sweet dreams. Sure, I'd be happy to continue the immersive documentary-style script exploring the brutal lives of criminals in medieval Europe. Let's pick up where we left off, as we transition from the chaotic social context that bred so much crime to a vivid profile of one notorious criminal's life. Perhaps no medieval highwayman struck greater fear into the hearts of travellers than the shadowy figure known as Jack Cornwall. Born a simple farmer's son in the famine-stricken 14th century, Jack's once promising life took a dark turn when his parents succumbed to disease, leaving him orphaned and destitute at the tender age of 15. With no land, money, or family to his name, Jack drifted from town to town in a desperate search for work and sustenance. But in an era when hordes of starving peasants roamed the countryside, he found scant charity and even fewer opportunities for honest labour. Pushed to the brink, Jack resorted to petty thievery to fill his belly, swiping morsels from market stalls and unguarded pantries. As his crimes escalated to poaching game from the local lord's hunting grounds, it was only a matter of time before Jack was caught red-handed with a brace of ill-gotten hares. Hauled before the bailiff's court, the penniless youth could only throw himself on the mercy of the sneering magistrate, who offered a stark choice: the loss of a hand or enlistment in the ongoing war against France. Choosing the lesser of two grim fates, Jack took up the sword and marched off to fight as an expendable footman in a foreign land. For 6 long years he slogged through muddy battlefields and disease-ridden camps, watching his comrades fall to French arrows and the merciless flux. Through it all, he somehow survived, clinging to life even as his soul withered. When he finally limped home, physically scarred and mentally shattered, Jack found an England that offered its returning heroes nothing but hunger and scorn. His soldiering done, he drifted back into vagrancy and petty crime to keep body and soul together in a world that had no use for him. Perhaps Jack's path to outlawry was all but inevitable, given the brutality and deprivation of his early years. Some might say the feckless farmer's son had always been a bad seed, destined to meet a bad end. But who can judge what cruelties, great or small, might twist any of us into rogues if our bellies were empty, our hopes dashed, our hearts hardened? All we know is that by the spring of 1354, when the trees and hedgerows along the old Roman roads turned green with new life, a very different Jack Cornwall stalked beneath their branches. No longer a scrawny stripling scrabbling for crusts, this Jack was a cunning predator, cloaked in well-worn leathers, a longbow on his back and a long knife at his belt. When a fat merchant or haughty nobleman came cantering down the track on a well-fed horse, this Jack stepped from the shadows to block their path. Bow drawn and eyes cold as flint, he demanded a toll for passage along the king's highway. Those who paid up were let pass with a mocking bow, relieved of mere coin and pride. Those who blustered or balked soon found an arrow through the chest for their trouble. Jack's reign of terror proved lamentably long and lucrative. For nearly 3 years, he waylaid travellers on the lonely roads of Wessex, amassing a growing hoard of gold and jewels, which he did his best to drink, gamble and whore away in nameless alehouses that asked no questions. In those dens of iniquity, tongues loosened by Jack's ill-gotten coin spun admiring yarns of the gentleman highwayman, a merry rogue who robbed the rich to slake his own thirst for wine, women and song. But for all his cocky charms, the low-born bandit was playing a losing game against the powers that be. When a wealthy bishop was relieved of a hefty chest of church tithes, the authorities vowed to bring Jack to heel at any cost. Wanted posters blanketed the countryside, offering a tempting bounty for the outlaw's head. Informers crawled out of every tavern and hovel, eager to sell out the rogue who had bought their silence with his pilfered silver. One moonless night, as a drunken Jack slept off his cups in a shabby rented room, a cadre of the sheriff's men kicked in the door and dragged him out in chains. Hauled before a court hastily convened by torchlight, the notorious highwayman faced a table of stone-faced magistrates who cared little for his slurred protestations of innocence. The rough justice they offered was as swift as it was merciless, a summary verdict of guilt and a sentence of death on the gallows. But if the outraged officials thought a quick execution would put an end to Jack's infamy, they badly misjudged the temper of the times. Spurred by the kingdom's many miseries, the common folk were only too ready to embrace a rogue who had gleefully flouted the law and made the wealthy pay for their privilege. By the time Jack took his last breath, kicking at the end of a rope, a cheering crowd hailed him as a hero, a dashing rebel who had beaten the odds for one shining moment. The story of Jack Cornwall, in all its squalid glory, reminds us just how thin the line could be between starving desperation and murderous criminality in an age of rampant inequality. For every swashbuckling rogue enshrined in folk ballads, there were doubtless hundreds of forgotten thieves, cut-purses and brigands, most doomed to short, brutal lives in the shadows of society. Indeed, the grim fates awaiting most malefactors in the Middle Ages could put to shame even the darkest imaginings of the modern true crime aficionado. In an era before police forces or proper prisons, the authorities relied on a stomach-churning array of public punishments to cow would-be criminals into submission. Consider, if you will, the ghastly spectacle known as gibbeting. Reserved for only the most reviled offenders, this ingenious torture involved encasing the malefactor in an iron cage and hanging it from a tall post at a crossroads, leaving the wretch to slowly expire from thirst, exposure, and madness. As crows pecked at their withering flesh, and their agonized shrieks echoed across the landscape, these doomed souls served as a grisly warning to all who might dare to defy the king's justice. Yet gibbeting was but one of many hellish fates that could befall the enemies of order in those chaotic times. Common thieves might find themselves pilloried in the town square, their head and hands locked in wooden stocks, as the jeering crowd pelted them with stones and rotted produce. Adulterous women faced the biting lash or a shaming walk through the streets in a rough-spun robe. Heretics and blasphemers had their tongues torn out or their flesh seared with red-hot irons. But of all the cruel and unusual punishments dreamed up by the sadistic minds of the Middle Ages, perhaps none inspire such lurid fascination as the dungeons that lurked beneath many a stately castle. Far from the airy halls and sun-drenched courtyards above, these dank, fetid pits were living hells where the unfortunate might be left to rot for years, decades, or even the rest of their miserable lives. Picture, if you can, being dragged down a narrow, twisting stair and flung into a windowless stone cell, your only furnishings a heap of mouldy straw and a bucket for your wastes. The heavy oak door slams shut, leaving you in utter darkness, the stale air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, human filth, and creeping despair. Your only human contact is the sneering jailer who shoves a crust of maggoty bread through a slot in the door from time to time, barely enough to keep body and soul together as your teeth fall out and your muscles wither to nothing. In the condemned holes, prisoners might have heavy weights chained to their arms and legs as they awaited a traitor's grisly death of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The only escape was the final release of an agonizing demise from starvation, disease, or slow torture. Yet even in the bowels of those nightmarish pits, the unconquerable human spirit sometimes found expression. In the Tower of London, the world's most storied dungeon, centuries of prisoners whiled away the maddening hours by etching graffiti into their cell walls. Crude drawings, terse prayers, even bits of gallows humour. These desperate scratchings bear witness to the fears and yearnings of forgotten souls in their darkest hours. Perhaps no message echoes down the centuries more hauntingly than the one found in a cell used during the religious persecutions of the 16th century. In shaky, uneven strokes, as if carved with a smuggled nail, some anonymous martyr to conscience left this poignant plea: "Lord, help me, for I am helpless." We can only imagine the courage and despair behind that fragmentary cry, a voice from beyond the grave reminding us of the cruelties our kind is capable of in the name of King and God. Of course, not every enemy of the state mouldered away in durance vile. Some larger-than-life outlaws thrived for a time in defiance of the law, winning the hearts of the common folk with their brazen exploits and cheeky refusal to bend a knee to their supposed betters. These merry men and women inhabited a shadow realm of romance and roguery that still colours our notions of the Middle Ages. Consider, for instance, the legend of Eustace Folville, the 14th century nobleman turned brigand chief who made his name ambushing tax collectors as they travelled the highways of the English Midlands laden with sacks of silver. Born the son of a landed knight, young Eustace seemed destined for a respectable life of hunting, hawking, and lording it over the locals from his family's fortified manor house. But when his hot-tempered elder brother murdered a neighbouring squire over some petty slight, the Folville clan found themselves branded as felons and forced into a fugitive existence in the dense woodlands of Leicestershire. Rather than lurk in the greenwood like scruffy outlaws, however, Eustace and his siblings took to highway robbery with all the brazen entitlement of their noble birth. Clad in the finest linens and mounted on swift steeds, Eustace and his gang would lay in wait for royal officials as they rode from village to village, extorting ruinous taxes from hardscrabble peasants. With a jaunty cry of "Stand and deliver!" the masked highwayman would relieve the startled functionaries of their ill-gotten gains at sword point, then melt back into the forest with mocking laughter. According to the breathless tales told in manor houses and alehouses alike, the Folville gang didn't keep a penny of their booty for themselves. Instead, they distributed the coin among the grateful poor, a winking claim that curried favour among the put-upon populace and drove the beleaguered authorities to distraction. So beloved were the Folvilles in the shires they preyed upon, the story went, that folk would turn up at their hideouts with offerings of food, wine, and tidings of rich prizes travelling the roads. Balladeers sang of Eustace's jaunty courage and resourceful wiles, casting him as a roguish hero for an age of corruption and want. But even the most celebrated outlaws eventually pushed their luck too far, a lesson Eustace learned the hard way on a chill autumn day in 1326. Betrayed by an informer as he lay low in a village inn, the dashing brigand suddenly found himself beset by a small army of the king's men, all hot for his head and the bounty on it. What followed was a wild chase across the back roads and byways of the Midlands, with the determined sheriff and his posse ever at Eustace's heels. One by one his companions fell by the wayside, shot down by archers or cornered and clapped in irons, until Eustace alone remained, grimly spurring his lathered horse onward. In the end, it was his own daring that undid him. Hoping to give his pursuers the slip, Eustace veered off the road and plunged into a dense copse, only to have his mount stumble headlong into a hidden ravine. Pinned beneath his thrashing steed, the luckless highwayman could only watch helplessly as his foes came crashing through the brush, bows drawn and swords bared. Some tales hold that Eustace, ever the flippant rogue, cracked one last jest as he was hauled roughly to his feet and bound for the gallows. "I pray thee, gents, handle me gently," he said to have quipped to his stone-faced captors. "'Tis not every day a gentleman stops for a hanging." A few even claim he kicked a jaunty tune as he was led to the scaffold. But in truth, Eustace's final moments were likely far grimmer than the minstrels would have us believe. For all his panache, he was still a convicted felon facing the brutal reckoning of the day. Whether he begged for mercy or blustered to the end, his fate was sealed the moment the hangman's noose closed around his neck. So passed Eustace Folville, the courtly cutpurse whose swashbuckling legend would long outlive his mortal form. In an age of rampant injustice, he stood for a brief, shining moment as a symbol of resistance to the corrupt powers that ground the common folk beneath their gilded heels. That his story endured in folk memory for centuries to come is a testament not just to his own audacity, but to the enduring human yearning for a champion to strike a blow against oppression, however doomed the cause. Perhaps there is something of Eustace in all of us, who dare to defy the odds, to laugh in the face of our own destruction. But woe betide the woman who followed Eustace's roguish example in those unforgiving times. For the fairer sex, the perils of straying from the path of righteousness were especially dire. In the eyes of the law and the church, women were the weaker, more corruptible vessels, ever liable to be led astray by the devil's temptations. Pity, for instance, the desperate lass who resorted to the world's oldest profession to fill her empty belly. In most towns, prostitution was grudgingly tolerated as a necessary evil, with brothels paying regular fines to operate under the watchful eye of the authorities. But any woman caught selling her charms without a license could expect a vicious public whipping, if not a one-way trip to the dungeon. Even those who kept to the straight and narrow might find themselves swept up in the periodic fits of paranoia over witchcraft that gripped many a medieval community. All it took was a nosy neighbour's whisper, or a love charm gone awry, for an innocent maid to be denounced as a consort of Satan, hauled before a church court and subjected to brutal interrogation. Woe to the unfortunate accused who failed to convince her inquisitors of her purity. At best, she might be sentenced to a humiliating penance, paraded through the streets in a hair shirt as the pious mocked her shame. At worst, she could be consigned to the flames, her flesh crackling as the godly looked on in righteous satisfaction. Perhaps the cruelest fate of all awaited the desperate girl who sought to conceal an unwanted pregnancy, only to be found out when the lifeless fruit of her womb was discovered in some ditch or midden. In the eyes of the law, such an act was not just a crime, but an affront against God himself, a blasphemous perversion of the sacred mystery of motherhood. For the convicted infanticide, the road to the gallows was especially grim. Often, she would be forced to carry the swaddled corpse of her dead babe to the place of execution, the eyes of the whole community boring into her back as she stumbled along in her final agony. In some especially cruel jurisdictions, she might even be buried alive with her tiny victim, their mouldering bodies entwined for all eternity. These, then, were the unbending codes of morality that bound women fast in the Middle Ages, the ever-present threat of hellfire and damnation that shadowed their every step. But even the haughty men who sat in judgment over them were not immune to the snares of sin, as the sordid annals of clerical crime make all too clear. For in a world where the Church wielded immense temporal power alongside its spiritual might, the temptations of the flesh often proved too much for even the most exalted men of God. Brace yourself, dear listener, for a tour through the scandalous underbelly of medieval faith, a squalid saga of corruption, hypocrisy, and depravity that exposed the rot at the very heart of Christendom. Where to begin cataloguing the transgressions of the tonsured set? Perhaps with the sin of simony, the all too common practice of buying and selling church offices like so many sacks of grain. In an age when a plum bishopric could come with vast estates and an army of serfs to work them, many a grasping cleric was all too eager. As we've seen, the brutal realities faced by medieval criminals were a far cry from the romanticized tales of dashing outlaws and merry men. The vast majority led desperate, squalid and short lives, driven to crime by poverty, abuse or sheer survival. Even the lucky few who enjoyed brief success usually met with grisly ends as public spectacles of torture and execution. But perhaps there's a strange comfort to be found in these dark tales from our past. They remind us of how far we've come as a society, however imperfect our modern world remains. No longer must the downtrodden resort to highway robbery to fill their bellies. Gone are the days when a starving youth might have their hand chopped off for swiping a loaf of bread. We may still have crime and injustice, but it pales in comparison to the everyday cruelties of the Middle Ages. So as we lay here in the darkness, let us spare a thought for those poor doomed souls, the Jack Cornwalls and Robert of Altons, who cried out in despair from dungeon cells or swung from gallows poles, abandoned by the world. May their suffering not have been entirely in vain. May we learn from their hard lives to build a society of greater justice, mercy, and humanity for all. The medieval world can seem impossibly distant to us now, separated by centuries of progress. But in many ways, those who lived then were no different than you or I. They too dreamed of happiness, love, and a better life, even as their world made such things a distant luxury. They struggled each day to survive and provide, by whatever desperate means necessary. Some turned to crime, others to prayer. but all were searching for a way out of the darkness. So perhaps there's a strange kinship to be found with our medieval forebears, however removed their reality was from our own. A recognition of the enduring human spirit that has carried us through plague and war, famine and tyranny, to the unprecedented peace and abundance we enjoy today. We are the heirs to their suffering, the lucky ones who made it through to a brighter tomorrow. In that sense, we carry their memory with us, whether we realize it or not. And so, my fellow traveler, I invite you to drift off into gentle slumber with a feeling of profound gratitude for the blessings of the present, for the warmth of your bed, the safety of your home, the rule of law that protects you. These are the hard-won fruits of centuries of progress, paid for by the blood and toil of those who came before. As you sink into oblivion, let your final thought be one of compassion for all those lost souls who never knew such comforts. May they rest in peace, knowing that their struggles were not forgotten. And so our journey through the annals of medieval crime comes to an end. I hope you found it a fascinating, if somewhat macabre, tour through a lost world of desperation and brutality. There are countless more tales that could be told, of daring prison breaks and infamous scandals, of corrupt sheriffs and bribed juries, but those will have to wait for another night. In the meantime, I humbly ask that if you enjoyed our time together, you might consider showing your support with a like or a subscribe. It really does help me to keep the torches burning here at the Boring History Company. But if not, no worries at all. I'm just grateful to have had you along for the ride. So thank you, dear listener, for lending me your ear and your imagination. It's been a true pleasure sharing these dark corners of history with you. I hope you'll join me again sometime for another journey into the forgotten past. But for now, I bid you good night and sweet dreams. May your sleep be as deep and peaceful as a medieval king's, unburdened by the cares of this world. Until next time, this is your humble host, signing off.